She walked the last 12 miles alone. The stagecoach driver had refused to go further, said the mountain road was suicide in this weather, said no woman in her right mind would attempt it on foot. Not in February, not in Wyoming territory, not with the wind screaming down through Cutter's Hollow Valley like something alive and furious and hungry for warmth. She tried it anyway, because the alternative was worse than any blizzard, worse than frostbite, worse than the 100 ways a mountain could kill a woman walking alone through knee-deep snow in boots that did not belong to her. The advertisement had promised one husband, one man, one chance at a life that did not involve being sold to the highest bidder in a Philadelphia parlor room, where the wallpaper cost more than most families earned in a year. What waited at the end of that road was something the advertisement never mentioned. 3 brothers, 1 ranch, and a door that had been closed to 23 women before her. But that moment was still hours away. To understand how Phoebe Langford ended up standing in a stranger's entry hall with frostbitten hands and borrowed boots and nothing in her pockets but $37 and the kind of courage that looks identical to desperation, you have to go back to that morning. Back to the sound of a fist hitting mahogany hard enough to make whiskey jump. Before we continue, if these frontier stories are new to you, hit subscribe. I share one every week. And drop a comment below telling me where you are listening from tonight. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, let us go back to that morning. The sound of Declan Ashcroft's fist striking the desk echoed through the 14-room ranch house like a rifle shot. The whiskey glass leaped an inch off the polished surface, papers scattered across the wood spinning in the draft that crept through the window frame no matter how many times he sealed it. And in the entry hall below, the 23rd woman to seek marriage at Broken Hawk Ranch was being escorted to her waiting carriage by old Farley Combs, who tipped his hat and said nothing because after 23 rejections, there was nothing left to say. Calloused hands do not tremble, not when they have spent 14 years breaking ice and bending wire and building fences in weather that would kill most men before lunch. But Declan Ashcroft's hands were not trembling from weakness. They were trembling from something he refused to name, something that lived in the space between anger and grief, in that territory where a man stores everything he will not allow himself to feel. He stood at the window of his second-floor study, watching the carriage retreat down the mountain road. February 1878, Wyoming territory. The snow had been falling for 3 days straight, and the wind cut through the valley like something with teeth. Below him, 15,000 acres of cattle ranch spread across the mountain they called Broken Hawk. 3 major streams fed the land. 4,000 head of cattle grazed what grass the winter had not buried. 14 buildings dotted the property from the main barn to the bunkhouse to the smokehouse to the forge, and 1 massive house built by a dead man for a family that never came. The house was the cruelest part. Josiah Ashcroft had designed it for laughter, for children running through the halls, for a wife singing in the kitchen while bread rose in the oven. He had built it room by room over 15 years, each addition a prayer to the future, each beam and stone and hand-carved banister an act of faith that the emptiness would not last. The emptiness lasted, and now his eldest son stood in that house alone, watching another woman leave, and the whiskey glass sat on the desk like an accusation he could not answer. Rowan entered without knocking. He never knocked. Middle brothers do not knock. They occupy space as though it has always been theirs, as though the air rearranged itself to accommodate them the moment they were born. Rowan Ashcroft leaned against the doorframe the way he always did. His weight shifted to one hip, his arms loose at his sides. Those same whiskey amber eyes that all 3 Ashcroft brothers shared watching Declan with a patience that bordered on provocation. 33 years old, 3 inches shorter than Declan, but built wider through the chest, the kind of build that came from years of riding and wrestling cattle and hauling feed in weather that treated human beings as an inconvenience. His dark hair was longer than Declan's, tied back with a leather cord, and his jaw carried the same hard line, the same stubborn set that their father had worn like a badge, and their mother had once described as the face God gives men who would rather break than bend. That was Senator Whitfield's niece, Rowan said. His tone was observational, not accusatory. He was stating facts the way a lawyer presents evidence, letting the information do the work, allowing the implications to settle on their own weight. This was how Rowan operated. He did not argue. He arranged reality in front of you and waited for you to see what he already saw. I did not need to hear the rest. Declan did not turn from the window. His voice had gone flat. That particular frequency that both his brothers recognized. It meant the wall was going up. The drawbridge was rising. The fortress that Declan Ashcroft had spent 6 years constructing around whatever remained of his heart was sealing shut stone by stone until nothing could get in and nothing could get out. Her uncle did all the talking, arrived with a list of her accomplishments like he was selling a horse at auction. Bloodline, temperament, breeding potential. That is not marriage, Rowan. That is acquisition. Maybe she wanted to come, and then she would have come alone. There it was, the test. Declan Ashcroft judged every woman by whether she arrived independently or as someone's proxy. It was his measure of character, his litmus for sincerity, the single criterion he applied to every candidate, regardless of beauty or wealth or family name. Did you come because you chose to, or did you come because someone sent you? And every woman had failed it. Not because they lacked independence, not because they lacked courage or character or the kind of steel spine that frontier life demanded. They failed because no woman traveled alone in Wyoming territory in 1878. Not in winter, not on foot, not without escort or carriage or family name clearing the way. The social conventions of the age made solitary female travel not just unusual, but effectively impossible. A woman alone on a mountain road was a woman inviting disaster, and every family, every father, every uncle and brother and well-meaning neighbor understood this and acted accordingly. The test was designed to be impossible. That was the entire point. Declan Ashcroft did not want anyone to pass. He wanted to keep turning women away one after another, 23, and counting so he could tell himself the problem was them. Their weakness, their dependence, their inability to meet a standard that no human being could meet. Because the alternative was admitting the truth, that the problem was him, that the walls he had built were not protecting him from unworthy women. They were protecting him from the terrifying possibility that someone worthy might actually arrive, and he would have to decide whether to let them in. Rowan knew this. He had known it for years, but middle brothers learn early which battles to fight and which to file away for a different day. He shifted his weight against the door frame, but did not leave. "The advertisement is still running," Rowan said. "I told you to pull it. You told me to pull it after the 5th response, then after the 10th, then after the 15th. You have been telling me to pull it for 3 years, and I have been ignoring you for 3 years, and here we are." "Here we are," Declan repeated, "with 23 women turned away and a reputation that makes us the laughingstock of the territory to you." "We are not a laughingstock. We are a mystery. There is a difference, and the difference works in our favor." Rowan's voice carried the dry precision of a man who understood leverage the way most men understood weather. Instinctively. Constantly. People are curious about the Ashcroft brothers. 3 men on a mountain, 15,000 acres, a fortune in cattle, and not a wife among them. That curiosity has value, Declan. It keeps our name in circulation. It keeps potential partners interested. And it keeps the door open for the right person whenever she decides to walk through it. Nobody's walking through that door. Somebody will. Rowan pushed off the door frame. Somebody always does. That is how doors work. He left the way he came, without ceremony, without the kind of dramatic exit that lesser men use to punctuate disagreements. Rowan Ashcroft did not need punctuation. His silences said everything his words did not. Holt appeared in the hallway behind Rowan as Rowan passed. The two brothers exchanged a glance that carried the density of a full conversation. Rowan's expression said, "He is in the fortress again." Holt's expression said, "I know." And beneath that exchange, deeper than words, ran the current of shared concern that had connected the 3 Ashcroft brothers since childhood, since the winter their mother died and the world stopped being safe, and the only reliable thing left was each other. Holt Ashcroft was 29 years old, the youngest by 4 years, and he occupied a different space in the household than either of his brothers. Where Declan built walls and Rowan designed gates, Holt guarded the heart of things. He was the keeper of what remained tender in a family that had learned to armor itself against loss. The one who remembered birthdays, who noticed when the hands were struggling, who sat with sick horses through the night and emerged at dawn smelling of hay and sweat, and the particular sweetness of animal trust. He had been in the barn. There was hay in his dark hair and the smell of horses on his sheepskin coat, and his hands gentler than his brother's, but just as strong, hung at his sides with the quiet readiness of a man who did not need to prove his strength, because his strength was not the kind that announced itself. It lived in patience, in the willingness to stay when others left, in the stubborn bone-deep belief that kindness was not weakness, despite a world that constantly tried to convince him otherwise. He stood straight, hands in his pockets, and his expression carried the thing Declan found most unbearable: sadness, not for the rejected woman, not for the disrupted morning or the wasted journey or the embarrassment of another failed introduction. Sadness for his brother, for the man standing at the window refusing to look at the people who loved him, because looking might require acknowledging that love existed and that he needed it, and that needing it was not a flaw but a feature of being alive. "She seemed kind," Holt said quietly. "Kind does not survive this mountain." Ma was kind. She survived it. The room went silent. Their mother, Eleanor Ashcroft, had died when Holt was 7, Rowan 12, and Declan 15. Fever took her during a winter, not unlike this one when the snow piled so high against the windows that daylight came through blue and cold, when the world outside the ranch house walls became a white wilderness that swallowed sound and hope in equal measure. She died on a Tuesday morning in January, while the boys were in the barn, and when Farley came to tell them, he could not get the words out. He just stood there in the barn door, with his hat in his hands and the cold pouring in behind him, and Declan knew. He knew before the words came, because the silence had a weight to it that only death produces, a gravity that pulls everything downward. Their father, Josiah, never recovered. He had loved Eleanor with the calming devotion of a quiet man who saves all his tenderness for one person, and when that person was gone, the tenderness had nowhere to go. It turned inward, calcified, became something hard and brittle that looked like strength, but was actually the opposite. He built the ranch bigger and bigger, as if square footage could fill the hole she left, as if timber and stone could substitute for the warmth that went into the ground with her. He added rooms nobody used, hallways that led to empty spaces, a library filled with books nobody read, a nursery that waited year after year for children who never came. Then he died of a heart attack when Declan was 22, collapsing in the barn on a cold morning in March, his hands still gripping the feed bucket, his eyes open and fixed on something none of his sons could see. They buried him on the hill behind the house next to Eleanor, and Farley carved the headstone himself, because the nearest stonemason was 3 days right away, and Farley said Josiah should not have to wait for his name to be written down. 3 young men, 200 acres of developed land, 40 head of cattle, and a debt to the territorial bank that should have buried them alongside their parents. It did not bury them. Declan would not allow it. He was 22 years old when he took control, 22 and already old in the ways that mattered, already hardened by loss into the kind of man who measured the world in problems and solutions and had no patience for anything that fell between those categories. He worked 18-hour days, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year. He expanded the herd from 40 to 400 in 3 years, negotiating cattle purchases with a ferocity that earned him respect from men twice his age. He cleared new pasture land with his own hands, felling trees and pulling stumps and building fences until his body was a map of scars and calluses and the kind of permanent exhaustion that becomes indistinguishable from normal life. Rowan managed the business, found contracts, negotiated prices, built relationships with suppliers and buyers and territorial officials who controlled the grazing leases that made large-scale ranching possible. He had their father's head for numbers and their mother's gift for reading people, and the combination made him formidable in ways that complemented Declan's brute force approach to problem solving. Holt tended the animals, improved the breeding stock, developed a reputation for horsemanship that brought buyers from as far as Colorado and Montana. He had their mother's hands gentle and knowing, and their father's stubbornness, which he applied not to building empires but to saving every animal that could be saved, nursing sick calves through the night, delivering foals in blizzards, treating injuries with a skill that the veterinarian in Cheyenne said surpassed his own. Together, the 3 brothers transformed 200 acres and 40 cattle into 15,000 acres and 4,000 head. They paid off their father's debt in 4 years, built the ranch into the largest operation in the territory within 8, And by the time Declan was 36, Broken Hawk Ranch was worth more than most men could earn in 10 lifetimes. But the house was still empty. The nursery still waited. And the table Josiah had built to seat 12 still hosted only 3. Do not, Declan said to Holt. One word, but it carried the weight of years. Years of building, years of refusing to bend, years of converting grief into labor, and labor into empire, and empire into a fortress so complete that nothing could threaten it. Nothing except the possibility that his youngest brother was right, and their mother's kindness had been strength after all, and the walls Declan had built were not protecting him but entombing him. Do not use her to argue for strangers. Holt held his brother's gaze for a moment, long enough to register disagreement, short enough to avoid the kind of confrontation that would crack something neither of them could repair. Then he turned and walked back toward the barn, his boots heavy on the wooden floor, and the sound of his leaving was the sound of patience that had not yet run out but was getting close. Rowan watched him go from the hallway, then looked at Declan through the open study door. You know he is right. I know he is 29 years old and still believes people are good. Some of them are. Name one. Rowan considered this, seriously. The way he considered everything, turning it over in his mind, like a contract clause, examining it from every angle before committing to a position. Farley, he said. Farley is not people. Farley is furniture. He came with the land. There was almost humor in Declan's voice. The barest crack in the ice. A fracture so thin you could only see it if you knew exactly where to look, and Rowan had spent 33 years learning where to look. He noted it, filed it away in the part of his mind that cataloged useful information, weaknesses, indefenses, moments when the fortress showed its seams, and he left without pressing further. He knew when to push and when to wait. Middle brothers learn that early, or they do not survive. Farley Combs found Declan in the study an hour later. The whiskey glass had been refilled and sat untouched on the desk, amber liquid catching the gray winter light from the window, and that single detail told Farley everything he needed to know about the state of Declan Ashcroft's soul. A man who pours whiskey and drinks it is tired. A man who pours whiskey and stares at it is fighting something that liquor cannot fix. Farley was 63 years old, built like the barnwood he resembled, weathered and hard and slightly warped by decades of wind and work and the particular kind of endurance that only the frontier demands. His face was a topographic map of Wyoming itself, deep lines carved by sun and cold. A jaw that had been broken twice, once by a horse and once by a man who made the mistake of insulting Eleanor Ashcroft in Farley's presence and spent the next 6 weeks eating through a straw. Blue eyes sharp and undimmed by age that saw things most people preferred to keep hidden. He had been working Ashcroft land since before the brothers were born, had served their father when Josiah was still a young man with more ambition than sense, clearing timber on a mountainside that everyone said was too steep, too cold, too far from civilization to support a ranch. Farley had believed in him anyway, had stayed through the lean years when they ate venison 3 meals a day because they could not afford beef, had survived their mother's death and watched 3 boys lose the center of their world and rebuild themselves around the absence. He had opinions about all of it. He shared them exactly when he wanted to and never a moment sooner. He sat down in the chair across from the desk without being invited. He had earned that right through decades of loyalty and the quiet understanding that Declan respected people who did not ask permission for things they had already paid for. 23, Farley said. I can count. Can you? Because from where I sit, you are counting the wrong things. Farley's voice was casual, the tone of a man discussing weather or feed prices or the condition of the south fence. But his eyes were anything but casual. His eyes were doing the thing they had always done since Declan was 15 years old and standing at his mother's grave trying not to cry. They were seeing past the wall, past the armor, past the carefully constructed persona of the man who could not be touched. You are counting women who failed your test. Maybe you should count the years you have been alone instead. I am not alone. I have Rowan, Holt, you, Nell, 12 ranch hands, and enough work to fill 3 lifetimes. You have employees and brothers. That is not the same thing as having someone who chooses you. Someone who stays not because they are paid or obligated or bound by blood, but because they looked at everything you are, including the parts you try to hide, and decided that was enough. Farley stood. He moved like the old timber he was creaking, but steady, stronger than he looked. Your father made the same mistake. Built this place so big there was no room left for living in it. My father died of a broken heart. No. Farley stopped at the door, one weathered hand on the frame, and his voice changed, lost its casual quality, became something harder. Something that sounded like truth delivered without anesthetic because the patient could no longer afford the luxury of painlessness. Your father died because he believed work was a substitute for love. He built this ranch into the biggest operation in the territory, and every board he nailed, every fence he strung, every acre he cleared was him trying to fill the space your mother left. And it never worked. Not once. Because square footage does not keep you warm at night, Declan. And cattle do not care if you are happy. He paused, let the words settle. And you are doing the same thing, only more successfully, which means you will be more alone for longer, with more to show for it and less to live for. Farley's blue eyes held Declan's amber ones, and the old man's gaze carried the particular authority of someone who has made every mistake he is warning you about. I am 63. I buried a wife, raised no children, spent my whole life on someone else's land. I do not regret the work. I regret the nights. Do not follow my path, Declan. It is colder than you think. He left. His boots made no sound on the stairs, because Farley Combs moved through this house, the way ghosts move through the places they once loved. Present but weightless, visible but unable to touch. Declan stared at the whiskey, drank it in one swallow that burned all the way down like a lit fuse traveling towards something he could not name and did not want to detonate. Poured another. Did not drink that one either. Outside, the wind screamed through Cutter's Hollow Valley, and the snow kept falling, and somewhere on the other side of the territory, a woman he had never met was buying a train ticket with $37 and the last of her hope. The morning routine at Broken Hawk Ranch proceeded the way it had every morning for 14 years, with the mechanical precision of men who had turned survival into habit and habit into something that almost resembled a life. Declan was up before dawn, as always. Sleep was a concession he made to biology, not a luxury he enjoyed, and he rationed it the way he rationed everything else. 5 hours, sometimes 4, enough to keep the body functional. Never enough to allow dreaming, because dreams were where the walls came down, and Declan Ashcroft could not afford to have his walls come down, not even in the privacy of his own unconscious mind. He pulled on his sheepskin coat, heavy as armor, and stepped outside into a darkness so complete it felt solid. The cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs, turning the moisture in his nostrils to ice before he could exhale. He walked to the thermometer hanging beside the main barn door and held a match close to read it. 20 below zero. Northeast wind, which meant the storm was pulling moisture off the mountains and the snow would continue for at least another day. He calculated in his head the way a general calculates before battle. The north herd needed checking. The fence line along Timber Creek needed repair, where a fallen pine had crushed 2 sections of wire last week. The water troughs in the main horse barn needed their ice broken before the animals could drink. And the supply wagon from Duluth Springs was 3 days overdue, which meant either the road was impassable or the driver had decided that delivering feed to a mountaintop ranch in a blizzard was not worth the risk to his life. And Declan could not honestly blame him for that assessment, even though it created a problem that required immediate solution. He crossed the yard in the blue-gray light, his boots crunching on packed snow that squealed with cold, and picked up the 10-pound sledgehammer that hung inside the barn door. The ice in the horse trough was 4 inches thick, formed overnight in the brutal cold, a sheet of clouded white that sealed the water beneath it like a lid on a coffin. He swung the hammer with the same precision he brought to everything. Each strike landed in the same spot, sending shards of ice spinning into the dim morning air, catching the first hint of dawn light and throwing it back in fragments. No wasted motion, no wasted energy. This was how Declan Ashcroft operated. Everything had a purpose. Every action served a function. There was no room for excess, not in movement, not in emotion, not in the words he spoke to the people around him. He had carved the excess out of himself the way a sculptor removes stone, deliberately, permanently. until what remained was hard and functional and immune to the kind of damage that softness invites. Inside the main barn, Holt was already with the horses moving between stalls, with the quiet confidence of a man who understood animals better than he understood people. He had been there since 4, which was an hour before Declan, but neither brother mentioned this because their schedules were not competitions, but parallel tracks that occasionally intersected. Holt checked each horse the way their mother had taught him, though he barely remembered her teaching it. The knowledge lived in his hands, not his memory, inherited through touch rather than instruction, the way some men inherit their father's walk or their mother's laugh without being conscious of the inheritance. Start with the feet. Lift each hoof, brace it against your knee, check for stones lodged in the frog cracks in the wall, the subtle heat that signals the beginning of laminitis. Then the eyes. Bright and clear means healthy. Cloudy or weeping means trouble. Then the breathing. Count the breaths. 8 to 12 per minute at rest. Faster means fever. Slower means something worse. Finally, the feed. How much oats consumed overnight. How much water drunk. Every detail went into the leather-bound notebook he wore on his belt, the same notebook their mother had used. Her handwriting was still visible on the first page, faded but legible. The ink blurred by years of handling, but still readable if you knew what you were looking for. Take care of the animal before you take care of yourself. He stopped at the stall of a chestnut mare named Copper. She was heavy with foal, her sides round and taut, her movements careful in the way of animals who understand instinctively that they are carrying something precious. Holt ran his hand along her swollen belly, feeling for movement, his touch gentle enough to calm her but firm enough to assess. Beneath his palm, something shifted. A kick, small but definite, life announcing itself from the warm darkness of the womb. "Soon now, girl," he murmured. His voice took on a quality that it never carried when speaking to humans. Openness, an absence of guard. Maybe next week, maybe sooner. He hung an extra blanket over the stall partition to block the draft that whistled through a gap in the timber where the barn wall met the roof. Small gesture, enormous care. The kind of attention that distinguishes a man who works with animals from a man who understands them. In the study Rowan had been working since 5, the oil lamp burning on the desk amid stacks of paperwork that would have overwhelmed most men, but that Rowan navigated with the systematic efficiency of someone who genuinely enjoyed the architecture of commerce. Government cattle contracts needed renewing. 3 separate contracts, each with different terms, different delivery schedules, different penalties for late fulfillment. Winter feed orders for oats, hay, and mineral salt had to reach Cheyenne before the road became completely impassable, which meant the letters needed to go out today by rider if necessary. He wrote to 3 suppliers in sharp, clean handwriting, black ink on yellow paper, the Ashcroft Ranch seal stamped in red wax at the bottom of each one. His letters were models of clarity, no ambiguity, no room for misinterpretation, numbers aligned in columns, terms specified to the penny, delivery dates bracketed by weather contingencies that accounted for the particular brutality of a Wyoming mountain winter. Numbers were his language. Contracts were his battlefield. Where Declan built with his hands and Holt tended with his heart, Rowan defended with his mind. He had read every book in the ranch library, most of them twice, and he corresponded with lawyers in Cheyenne and bankers in Denver and cattle buyers in Kansas City with a sophistication that surprised men who expected mountain ranchers to be illiterate. Rowan was not illiterate. Rowan was the most dangerous thing a business adversary could encounter. A man who looked like a cowboy but thought like a banker. And in the kitchen, the warmest room in the house, Nell Dunaway had been up since 4. Nell was 58, built solid as a foundation, stone with hands that could pluck a chicken knead, bread dough set a broken finger, and deliver a lecture on moral failings all within the same hour. She had come to Broken Hawk Ranch 12 years ago, hired by Josiah Ashcroft as a housekeeper, and had stayed through his death, through the brothers' transformation of the ranch, through 23 rejected women, and the accumulated loneliness of a house that should have been a home. The cast iron cook stove, 400 pounds of metal, hauled by ox cart from Cheyenne a decade ago, had burned all night. She stirred the coals with the iron pokers, added 2 splits of seasoned oak, and adjusted the damper until the fire drew properly, sending a column of heat up through the black stovepipe and into the chimney. The sourdough starter, which she had maintained for 9 years, went on to the warming shelf to rise. She punched it down with practiced fists, shaped 2 loaves, and slid them into the oven with the confidence of a woman who had baked 10,000 loaves and knew exactly how the dough should feel beneath her fingers. The smell filled the kitchen first, then the hallway, then the entry hall, then the study where Rowan was working, and the barn where Holt was checking horses, and the yard where Declan was breaking ice. The smell of bread yeast blended with wood smoke, and the coffee already brewing in the big copper pot on the rear plate. 4 scoops of ground coffee to a quart of water, boiled hard, then left to settle for 3 minutes. That was how her mother made it in Tennessee before the war, and Nell saw no reason to improve upon perfection. Breakfast was at 6. 3 brothers at the long table. Declan at the head because he always sat at the head because someone had to, and because neither of his brothers wanted the position, and because it was easier to watch both doors from that chair, and Declan Ashcroft always watched both doors. Rowan to his left, Holt to his right, 12 ranch hands at a separate table in the adjacent room, their conversation a low rumble of voices discussing weather and cattle, and the new man from Colorado who could not saddle a horse without the cinch ending up on the wrong side. Nell served bacon sliced thick from the smokehouse, slab eggs fried in the bacon drippings until the edges crisped and the yolks ran gold-hot bread with butter that she churned herself because the butter from town tasted like wax and coffee, black enough to stand a spoon in. She moved between tables with the efficiency of a woman who had fed armies and could do it again if necessary. Conversation at the brothers' table was brief, practical, and conducted in the shorthand of men who had worked together so long that complete sentences were an unnecessary luxury. North heard, checking after breakfast, need Crandall. Wind shift tonight. Tomorrow, maybe. Clouds say snow through Thursday. Timber Creek fence. Going myself after the herd. Nobody mentioned the 23rd woman. Nobody needed to. The subject hung over the table like smoke present and acrid and impossible to ignore, but the 3 brothers had long ago mastered the art of not discussing things they all knew needed discussing. It was their particular genius and their particular curse, this ability to sit together in shared silence and pretend that the silence was comfortable when it was anything but. After breakfast, Declan saddled his bay gelding and rode out to the Timber Creek fence line alone. He preferred solitude for this work, preferred the honesty of cold and wire, and the simple equation of a broken fence that needed fixing. There were no ambiguities in fence repair, no emotional complications, no questions he could not answer with a pair of pliers and a coil of wire. He carried his tool bag across the saddle horn. Wire cutters, post hammer, a coil of new barbed wire, the steel bright against the leather bag. Metal clamps, a small kerosene torch for heating wire ends before twisting because the temperature was low enough to make steel brittle, and a man who bent cold wire the wrong way would snap it like glass and lose an hour's work to a mistake that patience could prevent. The fence line along Timber Creek ran for 2 miles through timber and open meadow climbing gradually up the eastern slope of Broken Hawk Mountain. The fallen pine had crushed 2 sections where the creek bent south, snapping posts and tangling wire in a mess of broken wood and frozen steel. Declan dismounted, tied his horse to a standing tree, and began. He heated each wire end with the torch before twisting it around the post, steam rising from hot metal, meeting frozen air, a small cloud of warmth that dissipated instantly in the immense cold. His hands, big and calloused and scarred from years of this exact work, moved with the precision that only experience teaches. The calluses on his palms were thick enough to grip barbed wire without gloves, though he wore them anyway because a man who loses fingers to vanity deserves what he gets. Each knot was tight, each post was straight, each section of wire was tensioned just right. Not too tight, because wire that cannot contract in cold will break under its own rigidity. Not too loose, because cattle will find the gap and push through and scatter across the mountain and take days to round up. There was a science to fencing that most men never learned because most men did not fence in 20 below weather on a mountainside in February. But Declan had learned it from his father, who learned it from trial and error, and the knowledge was as much a part of him as his name. This was the kind of work Declan loved. Honest, physical, measurable. You could see what you had done in at the end of the day. You could point to a repaired fence and say, that holds, that protects, that keeps what is mine from wandering into the dark. There was no ambiguity in a fence. No uncertainty, no risk of betrayal. A fence did not promise to stay and then leave on a Tuesday morning because you were too much frontier and not enough yisher. He had been at it for 3 hours when he heard riders. Two horses coming from the direction of the main house moving fast for the conditions, their hooves punching through the crust of packed snow with a rhythmic crack that carried clearly in the cold, still air. Declan straightened wire cutters in one hand and watched them approach. Sterling, Fife, and Crandall brought their horses alongside his breath, fogging in the savage cold, their faces red above their scarves, and their eyes streaming from the wind. Sterling was 24, the youngest of the ranch hands, a lean, earnest young man from Nebraska who had come west looking for something he could not name and had found it in the daily labor of Broken Hawk Ranch. He was still new enough to be excited by most things and frightened by the rest, and his face carried both emotions simultaneously in a way that made him look perpetually startled. Crandall was 38, steady as bedrock, the kind of man who had been born old and grown into it gracefully. He had worked cattle in 3 territories, survived 2 stampedes, broken 11 bones, and spoke only when words were necessary and never wasted one. His face was the color and texture of old saddle leather, and his eyes, dark and patient, had the quality of water that runs deep and slow and carries more than it shows. "Boss, there is someone at the main house," Sterling said. His horse stamped and blew, eager to move, and Sterling steadied it with a hand on the neck that showed how much he had learned in 2 years. "Already told her you are not receiving visitors." "Good. She will not leave." Declan's jaw tightened. "She." "Came on foot," Crandall said. His voice was careful, neutral. He was presenting information without recommendation because he had learned years ago that Declan Ashcroft did not accept recommendations regarding women or the lack thereof. He presented facts and let Declan decide which was the only approach that did not result in a conversation neither of them wanted to have. No carriage, no horse, no escort. Walked up the mountain road alone, in this weather. Declan's wire cutters stopped mid-motion. His hands froze on the handles, not from cold, from something else entirely, something that moved through him like a tremor, through bedrock, subtle but seismic, the kind of shift that registers on instruments designed to measure things most people cannot feel. No woman walked alone in Wyoming territory, not in February, not on foot, not up a mountain road in a blizzard that had already killed 2 head of range cattle this week. Animals that weighed 1,000 pounds and were built for cold and still froze to death, standing up because the wind found the gaps in their winter coats and stole their heat faster than their bodies could manufacture it. The fact that someone had done this, had walked 12 miles through killing weather with no horse, no carriage, no protection except whatever she carried on her back, had done the one thing his impossible test demanded, the thing he had designed to be undoable, so he would never have to face the consequences of someone doing it. The first crack, not in the ice, in the certainty, in the 6-year-old conviction that nobody would ever pass the test because the test was impossible, and the impossibility was the point, and the point was to be left alone. Someone had passed. "She asked for you by name," Crandall added quietly. "All 3 of you. All 3. Not Mr. Ashcroft, not the owner, not the eldest. All 3 brothers by name, which meant she knew what she was walking into, or thought she did. She had read the advertisement, understood that C. Ashcroft was the signatory, and somewhere between Philadelphia and this frozen mountainside, she had learned enough to know that C. Ashcroft was not 1 man but 3, and she had come anyway. "She looks half frozen, boss," Sterling said, and there was something in his voice that had nothing to do with ranch business and everything to do with the protective instinct of a young man raised right by a mother who taught him that strength means standing between danger and the people who cannot defend themselves against it. "Nell has her by the fire, but she will not eat, will not take a blanket, just sits there, waiting." Declan felt the old anger rise, not at this woman, whoever she was, not at Sterling for caring, or Crandall for reporting, or the wind for bringing someone to his door when he had spent 6 years making it clear that his door was closed. The anger was older than that, deeper, directed at whatever circumstance, whatever cruelty, whatever failure of the world's machinery had driven a human being to walk 12 miles through killing cold to knock on a stranger's door. He had turned away senators' daughters in silk dresses and political connections. He had refused bankers' nieces with dowries that could purchase half of Laramie. He had rejected every calculated arrangement that Wyoming society could manufacture, every carefully brokered introduction designed to combine his land with someone else's ambition. But he had never confronted someone desperate enough to walk through death to reach him. Damn it. He swung into the saddle with the fluid motion of a man who had been mounting horses since he could walk, a movement so practiced it was indistinguishable from reflex. Let us go. The ride back took 40 minutes through snow so deep the horses waded belly high, in places plunging and surging through drifts that collapsed beneath their weight and reformed behind them as though the mountain were erasing their passage the moment they moved through it. The sky had darkened to the color of bruised iron purple-black at the horizon, and the storm had intensified from dangerous to lethal. Wind came in gusts that hit with physical force, pushing man and horse sideways, filling every gap in clothing with driving snow that melted against skin and froze again in seconds. By the time they reached the main house, Declan's face was numb and his hands were burning inside his gloves, and the bay gelding was blowing hard sides, heaving nostrils flared red against the white world. He dismounted and found not just Farley waiting on the porch, but both his brothers. Rowan leaned against the porch post. Of course he did. Arms crossed, expression unreadable. But his eyes were sharp, sharper than usual, and they tracked Declan's approach with the particular attention he reserved for moments that mattered. Holt stood straight, hands at his sides, snow in his hair, and his expression carried that quality Declan found most threatening. Hope. Not the naive hope of a young man who had never been hurt. This was something more dangerous. The careful, deliberate hope of a man who had watched his brother suffer for 6 years and had decided without making a sound about it that 6 years was long enough. Before you throw her out, Farley started, I will decide what happens in my house. Declan pushed past them, tracking snow across the entry hall, his spurs ringing on the hardwood floor like small bells announcing something that none of them were prepared for, already composing the speech he had delivered 23 times. You are not welcome here. The road is that direction. I wish you well elsewhere. The words were ready. They lived in his mouth like old tenants, familiar and comfortable, and requiring no thought to deploy. Then he saw her. Phoebe Langford sat in the chair nearest the fire, not huddled for warmth the way a freezing woman should have been, not curled inward with her arms wrapped around herself and her body folded into the smallest possible shape to conserve what little heat remained in her bones. She sat straight-backed, hands folded in her lap, shoulders square. The posture of a woman who had been taught that dignity was the last thing you surrendered, and who had decided somewhere on that 12-mile walk through the killing cold that she would not surrender it today. Her traveling dress was navy blue. Good quality fabric, the kind that came from a respectable Philadelphia dressmaker who understood that durability mattered more than fashion on the frontier. But the dress was worn thin at the elbows and along the hem, where it had dragged through snow and mud and the accumulated debris of a journey that no garment was designed to survive. The buttons were still fastened to the collar. Every single one. As though maintaining the integrity of her clothing was a form of resistance against the forces that had brought her to this place. Her boots were men's boots, too large by at least 2 sizes. The leather was scuffed and cracked and salt-stained from walking through snow that reached her knees, and the toes had been stuffed with cloth to make them fit wadded fabric visible at the ankle where the boot gaped away from her leg. That single detail told a story of resourcefulness that struck Declan harder than beauty ever could. She had no proper shoes for this journey. No women's boots rated for mountain travel in February, so she found shoes that would get her here. Found them or borrowed them or bought them from someone who did not ask questions about why a woman traveling alone needed men's boots 2 sizes too large. Problem identified. Problem solved. No complaint offered. Her honey blonde hair had partially fallen from its pins, loosened by wind and sweat, in the particular chaos of walking 12 miles through a blizzard. It hung in uneven strands around her face, framing features that were sharp with cold and exhaustion, but not defeated by either. And the firelight caught it in ways that turned ordinary into something else entirely. Something that made a man forget what he had been planning to say and stand in his own entry hall like a stranger in his own house. But it was her eyes that stopped him completely. Cornflower blue, large, set in a face that was pale with cold and drawn with fatigue, and marked by the kind of exhaustion that goes deeper than the body, the kind that settles into the bones, in the blood, in the place behind the eyes where a person stores everything they have endured. She was exhausted beyond measure, beyond the 12 miles, beyond the blizzard, beyond the journey from Philadelphia to Cheyenne to this frozen mountain at the edge of civilization. She carried the exhaustion of someone who had been running for a long time and had finally stopped not because she had found safety, but because her legs would carry her no further. And she was completely, utterly unafraid. That was the thing that reached through Declan's defenses and found the crack. Not her beauty, though she was beautiful in the way that a landscape is beautiful, not arranged or presented, but simply existing with a quality that demanded attention. Not her courage, though walking 12 miles through a killing blizzard required more courage than most men possessed. It was the absence of fear, the total absolute lack of the thing he saw in every other woman who came to his door. The calculation, the performance, the careful arrangement of expression designed to produce a desired result. Phoebe Langford was not performing. She looked at him the way you look at a locked door when you have walked a very long way and have nowhere else to go. Not with expectation, not with hope, not with the desperate optimism of someone who believes that if they just present themselves correctly, the door will open and the world behind it will be everything they need. She looked at him with the quiet acknowledgement that this is where the road ends, whatever happens next. She would accept the outcome. She would not beg for it. She stood when he entered. The movement cost her. He could see it in the way her weight shifted to her right leg, favoring the left ankle that was swollen beneath the oversized boot. She had been walking on that ankle for hours, walking on it through snow and wind and cold that would have dropped most men after the first mile. And she stood anyway because whatever had brought her to this place had also taught her that you face things standing up or you do not face them at all. All three brothers were behind him now. Declan in front, filling the entry hall with 6 feet 6 inches of barely contained fury and confusion, and the particular kind of fear that strong men feel when their certainties begin to crack. Rowan to his left, leaning against the wall, because Rowan was always leaning against something, studying the woman with those analytical amber eyes that missed nothing and revealed less. Holt to his right, standing straight, hands at his sides, his expression open in a way that his brothers were not carrying that quality of patient gentleness that animals trusted and people sometimes mistook for weakness. 3 men of extraordinary size filling the entry hall with the kind of physical presence that made most people retreat, that made most women look down, that made most strangers recalculate whatever plan they had arrived with and adjust it to account for the reality of 3 Ashcroft brothers taking up more space than the architecture intended. Phoebe did not retreat. She did not look down, did not step back, did not adjust her posture or soften her expression or do any of the 1,000 small things that people do when they are trying to make themselves less threatening to someone who could hurt them. She simply stood there, straight-backed and steady, and looked at the 3 largest men she had ever seen with the same cornflower blue eyes that had not flinched when the blizzard tried to kill her and would not flinch now. "Mr. Ashcroft," she said. Her voice was low, steady, roughened slightly by cold and exhaustion, but carrying beneath the roughness a clarity that cut through the tension in the room like a blade through rope. It was not a question, not an appeal. She was addressing all 3 of them with the same word because she did not know which one had placed the advertisement and did not care because the advertisement had brought her here, and here was where she intended to make her case, regardless of which Ashcroft was listening. "Which one?" Rowan asked from behind Declan. There was dry humor in it, his default setting the tone he used when situations interested him more than they alarmed him. And this situation interested him enormously. He had been running the advertisement for 3 years. He had processed 23 responses. He had watched his brother reject every single one with the systematic efficiency of a man clearing weeds from a garden. And not once in those 3 years had a respondent arrived on foot, alone, in February, in men's boots stuffed with cloth. Rowan was interested. Phoebe's eyes moved between the 3 of them. Declan saw the moment realization struck her, saw it move across her face the way weather moves across a valley, visible and unstoppable. The advertisement had said, "C. Ashcroft seeks a woman of good character and strong constitution for partnership and companionship on a working cattle ranch in Wyoming Territory." She had expected one man. She was looking at three who shared the same jaw, the same amber eyes, the same dark hair, the same build that came from years of the same brutal mountain labor. Three variations on a single theme, each one large enough to block a doorway, each one watching her with an intensity that would have sent most women back into the blizzard. All of you, apparently, she said, and there was something in her tone. Not defeat, not humor exactly, though it lived in the same neighborhood. A kind of exhausted recognition that the universe had once again exceeded her capacity for surprise. That she had walked 12 miles through a blizzard expecting to meet one impossible man and had instead met three, and the mathematics of impossibility had just tripled without her consent. "You need to leave," Declan said. The words came out the way they always did, hard, final, delivered with the certainty of a man who has said them 23 times and believed them every time, and will believe them this time too, because the alternative is to stop believing them, and if he stops believing them, he will have to face the question of what he actually wants, and he is not ready for that question. Not standing in his own entry hall at 4 in the afternoon with the wind howling outside and a woman looking at him with eyes that see past walls he has spent 6 years building. "I will." Phoebe did not move. "After we talk." "There is nothing to talk about." "Then I will be brief." She did not move closer, did not appeal to sympathy, did not perform the particular theater of vulnerability that Declan had seen in bankers' daughters and senators' nieces, the practiced softening of features and voice designed to activate the protective instinct that men were raised to feel and women were raised to exploit. She simply stated facts the way a person does when they have run out of energy for anything else. When the reserves of charm and strategy and social performance have been depleted by a 12-mile walk through death, and what remains is only the truth stripped of ornamentation delivered in a voice that is too tired for anything but honesty. "My name is Phoebe Langford. I answered your advertisement for a mail-order bride. I traveled from Philadelphia by train to Cheyenne by stagecoach, from Cheyenne to the foot of this mountain, and the last 12 miles on foot because the stagecoach driver said the road was impassable and would not come further no matter what I offered to pay him. I have no family who wants me. I have no money beyond the $37 in my coat pocket. I have no other prospects. And based on the 23 women you have already turned away, I suspect you have no intention of accepting me either." The room went silent, not the silence of emptiness, the silence of fullness. Every person in that house had stopped what they were doing. Nell had stopped working in the kitchen, her hands still on the bread she had been slicing, her eyes fixed on the doorway. Farley stood motionless near the stairs, his weathered face carrying an expression that Declan had never seen on it before. Something between recognition and grief, as though the old man was seeing something he had waited decades to see and was already mourning the possibility that it would be taken away. Even Rowan had stopped leaning. He stood straight for the first time since entering the room, his arms at his sides, his analytical mask slipping just enough to show the human being behind it. "So why are you here?" Declan asked, and his voice was different. He heard it himself and did not like what he heard. The hardness was still there, but it had cracked just slightly the way a frozen lake cracks in spring. Not enough to break through, just enough to suggest that what lay beneath was not solid all the way down. "Because the alternative was marrying a man 3 times my age to settle debts I never incurred in a city that killed my father and buried my mother's memory beneath 10 years of someone else's greed." Her voice did not waver. Her eyes did not drop. Her hands folded in her lap did not tremble. "My uncle arranged for me to become the property of a 56-year-old businessman who wanted a young wife the way some men want a new horse, for utility, for display, for the production of heirs who would carry his name and manage his estate after he died. And I decided I would rather freeze to death on a mountain in Wyoming than live that life. The honesty of it, the complete absence of strategy or seduction or performance. She was not trying to win them, not trying to charm her way past the defenses that had held against 23 women with better prospects and warmer clothing and the backing of powerful families. She was telling the truth, and truth was the one weapon that none of them, not even Declan, with his fortress and his walls and his 6 years of practiced rejection, knew how to defend against. Because you can argue with strategy, you can resist charm, You can see through performance and dismiss calculation and armor yourself against every weapon that human beings use to get what they want from each other. But you cannot argue with a woman who tells you she would rather die in a blizzard than marry a man she does not love. There is no defense against that level of honesty. It goes through walls the way cold goes through glass, not by breaking them, but by rendering them irrelevant. Declan stood in his own entry hall, 6 feet 6 inches of fortress, 230 pounds of muscle and scar tissue, and the accumulated armor of 6 years of solitude, and felt something shift inside him that he had spent those 6 years making sure could not shift. A crack, hairline, invisible to everyone except possibly Rowan, who noticed everything, and definitely Phoebe, who was looking at him with those cornflower eyes and seeing more than he wanted anyone to see. Nell, he called without taking his eyes off Phoebe. Set another place for dinner. Already done, Nell said from the kitchen, and the smile in her voice carried through the house like warmth from a fire that someone has been tending all night, waiting for exactly the right moment to open the door and let the heat reach the rooms that needed it most. Rowan's eyebrow rose. One eyebrow, the left one, his tell, the involuntary signal that something had surprised the man who prided himself on never being surprised. He looked at Declan, then at Phoebe, then back at Declan, and filed what he saw in the same mental cabinet where he stored market data and contract terms and the particular expressions on cattle buyers' faces when they were about to make an offer they did not expect to be accepted. Holt's face softened into something that looked dangerously like relief. The kind of relief a man feels when he has been holding his breath for 6 years without realizing it, and someone finally says the word that allows him to exhale. You can stay tonight, Declan said. His voice had the quality of a man making a concession he will regret. Grudging, controlled. Each word measured and weighed and released with the reluctance of a miser parting with coins. Storm is too bad to send you back, but in the morning you leave. Agreed. She sat back down with the same straight-backed composure, lowering herself into the chair with the careful precision of someone whose body was screaming in pain, but whose mind had decided that pain was not relevant to the current negotiation. And Declan walked away before the questions crowding his mind could escape his mouth. Who was she really? What had driven her father to ruin? What kind of uncle sells his niece to a man old enough to be her grandfather? And why did she look at him like she could see through walls he had spent 6 years building, and find behind them not the fortress he intended, but the frightened man he actually was? He walked down the hallway toward the study, did not look back, did not allow himself to look back because looking back would be an admission. And admissions were cracks, and cracks were the beginning of collapse, and collapse was the thing he feared more than blizzards or bankruptcy or the slow certain knowledge that he was becoming his father. Behind him in the chair by the fire, Phoebe Langford closed her eyes. Just for a moment. And the firelight played across her face, turning the exhaustion into something luminous. And Nell watched from the kitchen doorway with the expression of a woman who has been praying for something for 12 years and has just seen it walk through the door in borrowed boots. Dinner was the first time all 4 of them sat at the long table together, and the table itself told the story better than words ever could. Josiah Ashcroft had built that table from a single oak tree felled on the property the year Declan was born. He had milled the lumber himself, cured it for 2 years in the barn, and assembled the table in the dining room because it was too large to fit through the door once completed. It could seat 12, 14 in a pinch. It was the kind of table a man builds when he believes his future will be full of people, when he imagines holidays and harvests and the accumulated noise of a family growing into itself. 4 places were set along its length. Declan at the head, Rowan to his left, Holt to his right, Phoebe at the far end, separated from the brothers by 8 empty chairs that stood like witnesses to everything this house had lost. The empty chairs outnumbered the occupied ones 3-1, and the silence between the living was louder than any conversation the dead had ever failed to have. Nell served pot roast with potatoes from the root cellar, carrots and turnips, slow cooked in the drippings until they collapsed into sweetness, and bread still warm from the oven. The crust cracking when Phoebe broke it, steam rising from the soft interior like a signal from a world where things were still being made, still being created, still coming into existence, despite everything that argued against it. She watched the exchange between Declan and Phoebe with the intensity of a woman who had waited 12 years for exactly this moment, and intended to remember every detail. Declan asked questions the way a prosecutor conducts cross-examination. Short, direct, designed to establish facts rather than build understanding. His voice carried no warmth, no curiosity. Just the flat precision of a man cataloging information so he could use it to justify the decision he had already made, which was that this woman would leave in the morning and life would continue as before, and the 23 rejections would become 24, and the fortress would remain intact. You are from Philadelphia. I am. What brought you west? Phoebe set down her fork. Her movements were precise, economical. No wasted energy, no theatrical pauses, no reaching for water to buy time the way nervous people do when they are being interrogated. She looked at Declan directly the way few people ever did, because most people found the full weight of those amber eyes difficult to bear. The eyes of all three Ashcroft brothers carried a quality that went beyond color. They carried history, loss, the compressed intensity of men who had learned early that the world takes things and does not give them back, and the only defense is to become something the world cannot take. Phoebe bore the weight of that gaze without flinching. My father was a shipping merchant, she said. Everett Langford. He built a fleet of cargo vessels that ran trade routes along the Atlantic coast. Cotton from the south. Manufactured goods from the north. He invested everything he had, everything he was into those ships. They were more than his business. They were his identity. His proof that a man born without family money could build something that mattered. She paused, not for effect, for accuracy, choosing words the way a surgeon chooses instruments, selecting each one for its precision rather than its emotional impact. He invested in an expansion, 6 new vessels, borrowed heavily against the existing fleet, and in October of 1875, a storm system in the Atlantic took 4 of those vessels to the bottom in a single week. The insurance company refused the claim, said the ships were under-maintained, said the coverage did not extend to acts of God in waters he had been warned were dangerous. Her voice did not change, did not soften or harden or betray any of the things that must have been moving behind those blue eyes. He lost the business, the house, the savings. Everything that bore his name was taken by creditors who had been his friends 6 months earlier and were now his executioners. He died, Declan asked. Pneumonia, that winter. The doctor said his lungs gave out. I say his spirit gave out first, and his lungs simply followed. No emotion in her voice. Just fact delivered clean and unsoftened, the way you deliver news that has already been grieved and processed and stored in the place where a person keeps the things that shape them. He was a proud man, a good man. But proud men do not survive humiliation well. They internalize it. Turn it inward. Let it eat them from the inside the way rust eats iron. By the time the pneumonia came, there was nothing left to fight it with. He died owing money to half of Philadelphia, and the people who had dined at his table and called him friend would not even attend his funeral. Holt's fork had stopped moving. His food sat untouched on his plate, growing cold, and his amber eyes warmer than his brother's, but carrying the same depth watched Phoebe with an expression that Declan recognized and feared. Not sympathy. Sympathy was passive. What Holt felt was active. It was the same quality he brought to injured horses and sick calves and every vulnerable creature that crossed his path. The instinct to protect, to step between danger and the thing that could not defend itself. Except Phoebe was not defenseless. She was the opposite of defenseless. And that contradiction made Holt's protective instinct even stronger, because a woman this strong should never have been put in a position where strength was required for survival. His brother took guardianship, Phoebe continued. My uncle Hugo Langford, he settled some of my father's debts, created others. Rowan leaned forward slightly. The strategist in him was listening now, hearing patterns in the information, the way he heard them in cattle contracts and political maneuvering. His mind was doing what it always did, arranging facts into structures, looking for the architecture of the situation, identifying where the load-bearing walls were and where the weak points hid. My uncle is a man who sees opportunity in other people's misfortune. Phoebe's gaze shifted to the middle brother, and Declan noticed something that none of the 23 women before her had done. She addressed each of them distinctly, not as a unit, not as the Ashcroft brothers, interchangeable and indistinguishable, as individuals. She adjusted her tone, Her eye contact, her vocabulary to the brother she was speaking to, as though she understood instinctively that these three men, despite sharing the same blood and the same amber eyes and the same hard jaw, were three different people who needed to be reached in three different ways. He took my father's remaining assets and used them to establish credit in his own name. Then he leveraged that credit into relationships with men who had money and wanted things that money alone could not purchase. Phoebe's voice was steady, but beneath the steadiness ran something harder. Not anger exactly, something colder. The controlled fury of a woman who understood exactly how she had been used and had spent months converting that understanding from helplessness into plan. He arranged for me to marry Cornelius Pratchett, a businessman, 56 years old, very wealthy, very interested in acquiring a young wife to manage his household and produce heirs who would carry his name into the next generation. And you refused, Holt said. His voice carried its usual gentleness, the tone he used with frightened animals and injured men, the tone that communicated safety without making promises it could not keep. But beneath the gentleness ran something harder, something that Declan had rarely heard in his youngest brother's voice. The protective anger of a man who could not tolerate cruelty toward the vulnerable, directed not at Phoebe, but at the uncle who had tried to sell her and the system that had made selling her possible. I refused. What happened? My uncle called me ungrateful, said I owed my father's memory, said the debts would follow me wherever I went, that no city in the East would employ a woman whose family name was synonymous with failure and unpaid obligations. Phoebe took a sip of water. Her hand was steady on the glass. So I tested that theory. I took the $37 I had left hidden in a book he never opened because Hugo Langford does not read books, and bought a train ticket as far west as it would reach. In Cheyenne, I saw your advertisement at the posting office. C. Ashcroft seeks a woman of good character and strong constitution. Our advertisement asked for a woman of good character and strong constitution, Rowan said. And there was something in her voice that had not been there before. A shift in register, a warming of the analytical tone that he used for everything, as though the data he was processing had crossed a threshold from interesting to important, and the adjustment was involuntary. It does not mention that the groom is actually three men. For the first time, something close to humor crossed Phoebe's face. A ghost of a smile that appeared and vanished so quickly, Declan was not sure he had seen it, the way you are not sure you saw a shooting star because by the time your mind registers the light is already gone. No, it neglected that detail. That was my doing, Rowan admitted. He did not look at Declan when he said it, because looking at Declan would have been an acknowledgement that what he was about to confess required permission, and Rowan Ashcroft did not ask permission for things he believed were necessary. I placed the advertisement. Declan wanted it pulled after the first 5 responses. I kept it running. Declan's head turned toward his brother with the slow, dangerous precision of a man who has just been informed of a betrayal he should have anticipated but did not, because the betrayer was someone he trusted, and trust for Declan Ashcroft was not given lightly enough to be wasted on suspicion. You did what? Somebody had to try. Rowan held his brother's glare without flinching. 3 decades of brotherhood had taught him exactly how much of Declan's anger was real and how much was performance, and the ratio tonight was different than usual. More performance, less anger, which meant the woman at the end of the table was affecting him in ways he would not admit and could not prevent. We need help on this ranch, Declan. Nell cannot cook for 15 men and maintain a house this size alone forever. She is 58 years old, and she has been working since before dawn every day for 12 years, without a single day off, because none of us has had the sense to find someone to share the load. I never asked for help. No, you never do. That is the problem. Rowan's voice was calm but carried the weight of years. Years of watching his brother work himself into something hard and unyielding. Years of managing the business side of an empire that was growing faster than the men who ran it could sustain. We need someone to manage accounts, handle correspondence, organize supply chains that are currently held together by my handwriting and Nell's memory. And yes, Declan, we need someone who makes this house feel like something other than a mausoleum. I did not agree to that. You did not need to. I own 1/3 of this ranch, so does Holt. The advertisement was a business decision made by a 1/3 owner, And if you want to challenge it, you can take it up with the territorial court and explain to a judge why three grown men on a 15,000-acre ranch are incapable of living with a single woman. The tension between the brothers crackled like static before lightning. The air in the dining room changed pressure. You could feel it on your skin the way you can feel a storm approaching before you see the clouds tightening, a compression, the sensation of enormous forces holding themselves in check. Phoebe watched it with those perceptive blue eyes, and Declan had the unsettling sensation that she was seeing not just the argument, but everything beneath it. The loneliness, the fear, the grief that none of them had fully processed, because processing grief requires stopping long enough to feel it. And none of the Ashcroft brothers had stopped in 14 years. Three men who had built walls so high they had walled themselves in, and the irony of it was so obvious that only someone standing outside the walls could see it clearly. And Phoebe Langford was standing outside the walls. "I am not looking for a husband," Phoebe said quietly. Everyone turned to her. The statement landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water, ripples moving outward, reaching every wall. The 23 women before her had all been looking for husbands. That was the entire premise of the advertisement, the social contract upon which every previous interaction had been built. Woman seeks husband. Man evaluates woman. Woman is accepted or rejected based on criteria that the man controls. Phoebe had just rewritten the contract. "I answered your advertisement because I had no other options. Because the choice was between your mountain and a man old enough to be my grandfather in a city that had already killed my father. But I am not here to charm anyone." She looked at Declan when she said this, and her gaze was not challenging. It was clarifying, drawing lines so there would be no confusion about where she stood or what she expected. "I am not here to be decorative. I am not here to manage your household as though that were some kind of consolation prize for not being wanted. And I am not here to perform the role of potential wife for three men who clearly cannot agree on whether they want one." She paused, let the words settle, and when she spoke again, her voice carried an intelligence that surprised the room. Not because the words were complex, but because they were delivered with a precision that suggested a mind accustomed to cutting through confusion and arriving at the essential truth of things. "If you will have me, I will work. I will earn my keep. I will contribute to this ranch in whatever capacity you need. But I will not pretend this is a courtship when it is survival. And I will not apologize for being honest about the difference." Farley, who had been eating silently at the small table near the kitchen door, where he always ate, a spot he had chosen years ago because it allowed him to observe without participating and participate without being observed, chuckled into his pot roast. The sound was quiet, almost private. The laughter of a man who has lived long enough to recognize the arrival of something important and is both delighted and terrified by it. "Lord," he said, "she is going to be trouble." "The best kind," Nell added from the kitchen doorway, where she had been standing with a dish towel in her hands and tears forming in her eyes that she would deny if anyone mentioned them. "Eat your dinner, all of you. It is getting cold." That night the house settled into its usual silence, but the silence felt different. Charged, alive in a way that silence is not supposed to be alive. Like the air before a thunderstorm, when you can pass the electricity on your tongue and the hair on your arms stands up and every instinct in your body tells you that something is about to happen that will change the landscape permanently. Phoebe was given the guest room on the second floor. The room at the end of the hallway, the one with the small stone hearth and the window that faced east toward the valley. The room that had not been used since Rosalind Kemper stayed a single night 6 years ago and left the next morning boarding a stagecoach to Cheyenne and then a train to Boston, taking with her whatever remained of Declan Ashcroft's capacity for trust. Nell had aired the linens and lit a fire in the hearth, and the room smelled of wood smoke and lavender sachet tucked into the pillowcases years ago by a woman who believed in preparing for guests who never came. The bed was iron-framed, covered in quilts that Eleanor Ashcroft had sewn during the winters, when the snow kept everyone inside, and needle and thread were the only tools that could create something beautiful from something plain. Near midnight, Declan sat in the chair in the corner of that room, watching the stranger sleep. He did not know why he was there, could not have explained it to Rowan's analytical mind, or Holt's hopeful heart, or Farley's knowing eyes. Could not have articulated the impulse that had drawn him from his own room down the hallway, past the closed doors of his brother's rooms, to this chair. In this corner of a room he had not entered in 6 years. He only knew that the image of her walking those 12 miles through a blizzard in boots that did not belong to her had lodged somewhere behind his ribs and would not dislodge. That it lived there now embedded like a splinter. Not painful exactly, but impossible to ignore, a persistent awareness that something had entered him, and he could not remove it without cutting deeper than he was willing to cut. And sitting in this chair, listening to her breathe, watching the firelight play across her face and turn her features into something painted by the same hand that painted the mountains outside the window, was the first thing he had done in 6 years that was not about the ranch, or the cattle, or the contracts, or the walls. The first thing that served no function, solved no problem, advanced no agenda. He was simply present with another human being in the dark. And the simplicity of it was more terrifying than anything the mountain had ever thrown at him. She stirred. A sound escaped her lips, half gasp, half groan, as pain shot through her ankle. The ankle she had walked 12 miles on, the ankle that Nell had wrapped in cloth and packed with snow to reduce the swelling. Even in sleep, her body remembered the journey, the muscles that had carried her, the bones that had borne her weight through knee-deep drifts while the wind tried to push her backward and the cold tried to convince her to stop. Easy, Declan said. The word left his mouth before his mind could stop it. Gentle. Automatic. The same word he used with injured horses. The same word his mother had used with him when he was small and frightened, and the world was too large for a boy who had not yet learned to make himself larger than the things that scared him. She had not known he was there. Her eyes opened and found him in the darkness, found the shape of him in the chair, the bulk of his shoulders, the amber eyes that caught the firelight and reflected it back like something alive. For a moment, neither of them moved. The fire crackled between them. The wind pressed against the window like something trying to get in. "How long have you been sitting there?" she asked. Her voice was thick with sleep, but clear with something else. Not alarm, awareness. The awareness of a woman who has learned to track the presence of men in rooms because survival sometimes depended on knowing exactly where they were and what they intended. Does it matter? Oh, I think it does. She settled back against the pillows and the motion pulled a wince from her that she tried to hide and did not entirely succeed. "Are the cattle safe?" I heard the hands talking about a section of north fence down near the ravine. The question surprised him, not the content. The order she had woken to find a man she barely knew sitting in the darkness of her room, and her first question was not about him or about herself or about the strangeness of the situation. Her first question was about the cattle, about the ranch, about the thing that mattered to him more than anything except the brothers sleeping down the hall. "Cattle are fine. Fence will hold until morning." "Good." Silence. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind screamed through Cutter's Hollow Valley with a sound like something grieving, long and low and relentless, the kind of sound that seeps into a house through every key and makes the warmth inside feel borrowed and temporary. "Nobody has risked themselves for me in a very long time," Declan said, and the words came out before he could stop them. They came from the place behind his ribs, where the image of her walking lived, from the crack in the wall that her arrival had created, from the deep well of loneliness that he had covered with work and distance, and the daily practice of needing no one. He was not talking about tonight, not about the walk through the blizzard, though that alone would have been enough. He was talking about something larger, something that had calcified inside him over 6 years of solitude and rejection and the careful, systematic construction of a life that required nothing from anyone. "That is because you do not let anyone close enough to try," Phoebe said. The observation landed the way all her words did, without performance, without strategy, without the softening qualifiers that most people used when telling someone a truth they did not want to hear. Just honest perception delivered in a voice that was too tired for anything but accuracy. "You see too much," he said. "I see what is there. I see 3 brothers who built this mountain into a fortress. You built the walls, Declan. Every brick, every stone, every refusal. You made sure nothing could get in because you decided that nothing getting in was safer than something getting in and then leaving." She did not look away from him, did not soften her gaze or her voice. "Rowan designed the gates, the contracts, the systems, the way the world interacts with this ranch, controlled and measured and filtered through his mind, so that nothing arrives without being analyzed and nothing leaves without being accounted for. And Holt guards the heart of it, the animals, the land, the part of this place that is still alive and still growing and still capable of tenderness. She paused, and when she continued, her voice was quieter but no less precise. And none of you know how to let anyone inside because the last time you did, someone left. You do not know about that. I know loss, Phoebe said. I watched my father build a life with his own hands and lose it to a storm that lasted 4 days. I watched despair consume a good man the way fire consumes wood from the inside out, until what remained was only the shape of what had been. I know what loss does to the people left behind. It teaches you that love is not protection, that wanting someone cannot save them, that sometimes the safest thing is to stop wanting altogether. The fire had burned low. The room was dimming, shadows advancing from the corners, closing around them, like the walls of the conversation itself, pushing them closer to the truth that lived at the center of everything neither of them wanted to say. Her name was Rosalind, Declan said. The admission cost him something visible, a tightening in his jaw that made the tendons in his neck stand out. A shift in his breathing deeper, controlled the breathing of a man managing pain that he has not felt in years because he sealed it away so thoroughly that accessing it requires breaking something he is not sure he can repair. 6 years ago, she came from Boston, educated, beautiful, the kind of woman who makes a room feel smaller when she enters it, not because she takes up space, but because she fills it with expectations that most rooms cannot meet. His voice was flat, but beneath the flatness ran something raw. She wanted me to leave Wyoming, move to Boston, become civilized. She said this ranch was a monument to stubbornness and that I was building a prison and calling it a home. She said I was too much frontier and not enough equature. She wanted you smaller. Yes, and you refused. I told her this land was who I am, that the mountain and the cattle and the fences and the cold were not obstacles I was enduring, but pieces of something I was building. That I would not leave because leaving would mean becoming someone I did not recognize, and I would rather be alone as myself than accompanied as a stranger. She left. The next morning, that room you were sleeping in, she packed her bag and walked down to the stagecoach stop and boarded the morning coach to Cheyenne, and I never heard from her again. He was looking at the fire now, not at Phoebe, because looking at Phoebe while telling this story would have required a level of vulnerability that he was not yet capable of, even in the dark, even with the walls cracking. That first year after I shut everything down, would not see anyone, would not go to town, would not attend church or participate in the community gatherings that Nell organized. Just worked, sun up to sundown and then some until the work filled every space where the loneliness tried to live. And then the women started coming. Word about the ranch spread, about the 3 brothers on the mountain, about the fortune in cattle and the house with empty rooms and the advertisement that nobody had answered successfully. Families started sending their daughters. Bankers sent their nieces. A senator sent his cousin. 23 in 5 years. And I turned every single one of them away because none of them saw past the land to the man who built it. None of them looked at me and saw anything except acreage and cattle counts and the chance to become Mrs. Ashcroft of Broken Hawk Ranch. Until me. The words hung between them. 2 words, 3 syllables, a bridge thrown across the chasm that separated them, slender as wire, but strong enough to bear the weight of everything they had said and everything they had not. Declan stood abruptly. The chair scraped against the wooden floor, breaking the intimacy of the moment, the way a stone breaks the surface of still water, turning reflection into ripples. You should rest. Declan, she said his name. Just his. Not Mr. Ashcroft. Not all 3 of you. Just his name spoken in a voice that was gentle and firm, at the same time intimate and careful, a voice that understood the difference between invasion and invitation. And the sound of it stopped him at the door the way a physical hand could not have stopped him, because a physical hand he could have resisted, but the sound of his name and her voice went through every defense he had. Thank you, she said, for sitting with me. He did not turn around. He could not, because if he turned, she would see that his eyes were burning, that the moisture gathering at their corners was not from the smoke or the cold, but from something deeper, something that had been frozen inside him for 6 years and was beginning against his will and without his permission to thaw. And Declan Ashcroft had not let anyone see him that vulnerable since he was 22 years old, standing at the edge of a grave on the hill behind this house, watching his father's coffin go into the frozen ground while the wind blew snow across the headstone that bore his mother's name. "Rest," he said, and closed the door behind him. In the hallway, he leaned against the wall and breathed. Deep breaths, the kind of breathing a man does when he is trying to reassemble something that has come apart, trying to rebuild the walls that a woman's voice has just walked through as though they were made of paper instead of stone. And downstairs, Rowan, who never slept when there was something worth observing, sat in the leather chair beside the cold fireplace in the study, a book open on his lap that he had not read a single page of, and noted the time on the mantel clock. Noted the sound of Declan's boots in the upstairs hallway moving away from the guest room. Noted the long pause before those boots reached Declan's own door. And noted the expression on his eldest brother's face when Declan finally descended the stairs 30 minutes later for a glass of water, his eyes carrying a quality that Rowan had not seen in them for 6 years. Something open, something terrified, something alive. "She is going to stay, is she not?" Rowan said from the darkness of the study. Declan stopped at the foot of the stairs. His hand rested on the banister that his father had carved from a single piece of mountain pine, the wood smoothed by decades of hands, traveling up and down, a history of touch embedded in the grain. He did not answer, but he did not say no. And for the Ashcroft brothers, that silence was seismic. That silence was the sound of 23 rejected women and 6 years of solitude, and a fortress built on the conviction that loneliness was safer than loss, all of it shifting on its foundation. Not collapsing, not yet, but moving, settling, making room for something that had not been there before, for the possibility that the door might open, for the possibility that someone might walk through it, for the possibility that a woman in borrowed boots carrying nothing but $37 and a refusal to let fear make her decisions had done the one thing that 23 women with dowries and connections and family names could not do. She had knocked. And the fortress for the first time had not known how to keep the door closed. The blizzard settled in the next day with a ferocity that turned the world outside the ranch house into something hostile and white and absolute. Wind speeds reached a level that bent the pines along the ridgeline nearly horizontal, their trunks groaning under the pressure like old men carrying loads they should have put down years ago. Snow accumulated so rapidly that the hands worked in shifts just to keep the barn doors accessible, shoveling paths that filled in behind them almost as fast as they could clear them, an exercise in futility that they performed anyway because the alternative was letting the mountain win. And men who worked for Declan Ashcroft did not let mountains win. The thermometer beside the main barn dropped so low that the mercury seemed to have given up entirely. It sat at the bottom of the glass tube like something defeated, refusing to register a number that would only confirm what every living thing on the property already knew, that the cold was no longer weather. It was geography. It had become the landscape itself, as permanent and unyielding as the stone beneath the snow. Phoebe was awake before dawn. Declan found her in the kitchen, standing beside Nell at the big iron stove, cracking eggs into a skillet with the efficient motions of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Not slowly the way a guest cracks eggs when trying to be helpful without being intrusive. Fast, clean, one-handed. The shell splitting evenly, the yolk sliding into the hot fat without breaking the empty shell, tossed into the bucket beside the stove without looking. She was wearing the navy dress cleaned and pressed, and she had pinned her hair back with the same precision she brought to everything every strand accounted for. Nothing wasted, nothing out of place. "You do not need to do that," he said from the doorway. She did not turn. "I am not paying for my stay with idleness." "You are not paying at all. You are a guest." Guest implies invitation. She glanced at him over her shoulder, and for one brief instant their eyes held. Amber meeting cornflower. Fire meeting skiing. The contact lasted less than a second, but carried the density of a conversation that neither of them was ready to have. "I showed up uninvited in a blizzard wearing someone else's boots. That does not make me a guest. That makes me an obligation. Let me at least be a useful one." Nell snorted from the stove, a sound that managed to communicate amusement, approval, and vindication simultaneously. "Girl has more sense than the three of you combined. Let her work if she wants to." The morning passed with an uneasy truce. Phoebe worked. She moved through the kitchen with the practiced awareness of a woman who had managed a household through 7 years of declining fortune, who understood instinctively where things belonged and how tasks connected and which jobs needed doing first. She washed dishes before Nell asked, wiped counters before crumbs accumulated, found the broom without being told where it was, and swept the kitchen floor with strokes so efficient that Nell stood watching her for a full minute before remembering that she herself had work to do. The brothers rotated between checking livestock, maintaining structures, and trying not to think about the woman in their kitchen who did not fit any category they had built for women who came to Broken Hawk Ranch. She was not a bride. She had said so explicitly. She was not a guest. She had rejected the term. She was not an employee. Nobody had offered wages. She existed in a space between all these definitions, and the indefinition of her presence was more unsettling than any of them would admit. Declan checked the horse barn, broke ice in the troughs, inspected the hay stores, and calculated feed ratios in his head, which was easier than calculating the other thing that his head kept trying to calculate, which was how long she would stay, and what would happen when she left, and why the thought of her leaving produced a sensation in his chest that felt less like relief and more like the onset of something he refused to name. Rowan worked in the study, wrote letters, reviewed contracts, and periodically glanced out the window toward the kitchen where he could see Phoebe through the frost-covered glass moving between stove and counter and sink with the kind of systematic efficiency that he recognized because it was identical to his own. Holt was in the barn with Copper. The mare was restless, pacing her stall, her ears flicking at sounds only she could hear. Holt sat on an overturned bucket outside her stall and spoke to her the way he always did in a low, steady murmur that carried no specific words but communicated everything a pregnant horse needed to know. That she was safe, that she was watched, that whatever was coming would be met with hands that knew what they were doing. Then midday Crandall burst through the door. His face was white, not from cold, from the particular shade of white that a man's face turns when he has seen something that requires immediate action, and the margin for error is measured in minutes rather than hours. Snow caked his coat and his hat, and the scarf wrapped around his face, and his breath came in ragged gasps that fogged in the warm kitchen air, like smoke signals from a body running at its limit. "North fence is down," he said, 40 head drifting toward Timber Creek Ravine. Every man in the room understood what that meant. Timber Creek Ravine was a 100-foot drop onto rocks and frozen creek bed, a vertical wall of stone and ice that appeared without warning at the edge of a meadow hidden by snow until you were standing at its lip, looking down into darkness. Cattle driven by wind and panic would walk straight off the edge without understanding what was happening until the ground disappeared beneath them, and by then understanding was irrelevant because gravity does not negotiate. 40 head. At current market prices, that was more than most men earned in 5 years. But the number was secondary to the reality, which was that 40 living, breathing animals were minutes from a death that could be prevented if men moved fast enough and rode hard enough and were willing to put themselves between a panicking herd and a 100-foot drop in the worst blizzard the territory had seen in a decade. The Ashcroft brothers moved as a single unit. Years of crisis response compressed into instant action. The body remembers what the mind does not have time to think. Declan issued orders with the clipped precision of a field commander, his voice carrying through the house without being raised, each word landing on its target the way his fence hammer landed on post heads. Exactly. Completely. Without waste. Crandall, get the South crew. Every man who can sit a saddle. Rowan, coordinate from the stable. I want every horse that is not lame saddled and ready in 10 minutes. Holt the lead horses, your best 4. We will need animals that can think in this wind. Rowan was already moving, pulling on his coat, calculating logistics with the part of his brain that never stopped calculating. How many riders? How many ropes? How much time before the herd reached the ravine edge? How much time they did not have? Holt was out the door before Declan finished speaking, heading for the barn at a run, his boots punching through the snow crust, his body leaning into the wind that tried to push him backward. He knew which horses could handle this, knew them by name and temperament, and the particular quality of steadiness that separated a good cattle horse from a horse that would panic in a blizzard and add to the disaster instead of preventing it. And Phoebe Langford, standing in the kitchen doorway, with flour on her hands from the bread she had been helping Nell shape and fire in her eyes, that had nothing to do with the stove behind her, said 4 words that changed everything. I am coming with you. All 3 brothers turned. For one moment they looked so identical in their shock that Phoebe almost smiled. The same amber eyes widening by the same fraction. The same hard jaws dropping by the same degree. 3 variations on a single expression of disbelief, as though the universe had spoken in a language they understood perfectly, but had never expected to hear from this particular source. You cannot ride in this weather, Declan said. His voice carried the automatic authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed, the tone that sent 12 ranch hands into motion without question. But Phoebe was not a ranch hand, and the automatic authority that moved men like Sterling, Fife, and Crandall bounced off her the way the wind bounced off the granite face of Broken Hawk Mountain, present but ineffective. Can you, she asked, that is different. Well, why? Because you are a man. She stepped forward, and even with flour on her hands and a borrowed apron around her waist and an ankle that was still swollen beneath the oversized boot, she carried a quality that made the question rhetorical. I rode through Massachusetts blizzards for 3 winters when I was a girl. My father kept horses, good horses. He taught me to ride before he taught me to read because he said a woman who could ride could go anywhere, and a woman who could only read could only imagine going. I can sit a saddle. This is not Massachusetts. I know. Harder weather, harder land, harder men. She faced him directly, not challenging, not performing, simply standing in his path and stating facts with the same quiet precision she had used the night before when she told him about her father's ships and her uncle's scheme and the $37 hidden in a book. But those cattle will not wait for your pride to settle, and you need every rider you have. Rowan grinned. He could not help it. The grin appeared on his face like sunlight through a break in storm clouds, sudden and involuntary, and gone almost as quickly as it came. But Declan saw it. And Holt, standing in the doorway with 4 halters in his hands, he looked at Declan with an expression that communicated volumes without a single word. An expression that said, if you say no to this woman, you will regret it for the rest of your life, and I will make sure you know I know. Fine, Declan said through teeth that could have cracked walnuts. But you stay between Rowan and Holt. You follow orders. Every order, without hesitation and without argument. And if I say come back, you come back. Immediately, no discussion. Agreed. 20 minutes later, they rode into hell. The wind tried to rip them from their saddles. It came from the northeast in sustained gusts that hit with the force of something physical, something with weight and intention pushing against their bodies with a pressure that made breathing difficult and staying mounted an act of continuous resistance. Snow came sideways, horizontal, blinding, not falling from the sky, but flying through the air parallel to the ground, each crystal sharp as ground glass, finding every gap in clothing, every exposed inch of skin, every opening between scarf and collar and hat brim. The temperature was so far below zero that the distinction between cold and pain had ceased to exist. Every exposed surface burned within seconds. Fingers, ears, the bridge of the nose above the scarf line. Every breath felt like inhaling broken glass, the air so cold that it crystallized the moisture in the lungs and sent it back out as vapor that froze on contact with skin and fabric and horsehair. The horses fought for each step. These were mountain-bred animals, tough and sure-footed and accustomed to conditions that would kill lesser stock. But even they struggled, their powerful legs plunging through drifts that reached their bellies, their broad chests breaking trail through snow that reformed behind them like water closing over a stone. Phoebe rode between Rowan and Holt as ordered. Her seat was good, better than good. She rode the way someone rides who learned young and never forgot, whose body had absorbed the rhythms of horsemanship before her mind could form the words to describe them. Her weight was centered. Her hands were quiet on the reins, not pulling, not correcting, maintaining the light contact that told the horse she was present without telling it what to do. Her legs moved with the animal's stride, absorbing the surge and plunge of each step through drifted snow. Her balance instinctive, automatic, the product of years on horseback that no amount of instruction could replicate. Rowan noticed. His analytical eye tracked her riding the way it tracked everything, measuring competence, assessing risk, filing the data in the mental cabinet marked relevant. She could ride, not adequately, Well, well enough that her presence on this operation shifted from liability to asset in the span of 100 yards. Holt noticed, and what he noticed went beyond technique. He noticed the way she spoke to the horse beneath her. Not words exactly, sounds. The same low murmur he used himself, the language that existed between humans and animals. Before words were invented, a vocabulary of tone and pressure and breath that communicated safety and purpose and the simple message that they were in this together. Declan, who rode ahead of them all, breaking trail on his bay gelding, with the grim determination of a man who has decided that the storm will yield before he does, forced himself not to look back. Looking back would be an admission that he cared whether she was keeping up. And caring would be a crack. And a crack would be the beginning of something he was not prepared to begin. Not yet, not while 40 head of cattle were walking toward a cliff. They reached the herd. 40 head, maybe more. Dark shapes stumbling through deep snow toward the ravine edge, driven by wind that pushed from behind and blind panic that pulled from within, moving forward into darkness and death, without knowing the difference, because cattle do not understand geography. They do not comprehend cliffs. They know only the wind at their backs and the animal in front of them, and the instinct to keep moving that was wired into their blood 10,000 years before the first fence was built. "Circle them!" Declan shouted over the roar of the storm. His voice barely carried. The wind stole it from his lips and scattered it across the meadow like something shredded. "Turn the lead animals toward the eastern shelter, cut the front of the herd, and push them east." The riders spread out, 7 men and 1 woman against 40 animals in a storm that was trying to kill all of them. Declan went left, driving his gelding along the herd's flank, his rope coiled and ready. Crandall took the right flank, steady as always, his horse moving with the calm deliberation of an animal that had done this before and understood the stakes. Rowan moved to block the ravine approach, positioning himself between the cliff edge and the herd's direction of travel, a human wall mounted on 800 pounds of horse. Holt held the center, his voice carrying above the wind in a tone that the cattle could hear, low and steady, the sound of authority that even panicked animals recognize. And Phoebe, against every order, against every instruction, Declan had given, against every reasonable instinct that a person possesses when standing between a stampeding herd and a 100-foot drop into darkness, saw Sterling Fife riding directly into the path of the lead cattle. The young hand was positioned too far forward. Driven by the eagerness that youth mistakes for courage, he had pushed ahead of his assigned position, trying to turn the lead animals before they reached the danger zone. But the wind had shifted and the led cattle had changed direction, and now Sterling was directly in front of a wave of panicked beef that weighed collectively more than 30,000 pounds and was moving with the momentum of terror. He was about to be caught between the herd and the ravine edge, between 1,000 pounds of panicked animal and 100 feet of empty air. And he did not see it coming, because the snow had stolen his visibility and the wind had stolen his hearing, and death was coming at him from the front, while he watched the wrong direction, his head turned toward the herd's flank, trying to see through the blinding white, unaware that the thing he needed to see was already too close to avoid. Phoebe spurred her horse forward. She did not think. Thinking would have taken too long and produced the wrong answer. Thinking would have told her that what she was about to do was insane, that she was a woman from Philadelphia on a borrowed horse in the worst blizzard in a decade, riding toward a stampeding herd and a cliff edge, and a young man who had seconds to live. Thinking would have told her to stay where she was, to follow orders, to let the men handle it because the men were experienced and she was not, and the calculus of risk said clearly and unambiguously that she should remain between Rowan and Holt and let the experienced riders manage the crisis. She did not think, she acted. She cut across the herd's path at an angle that used her horse's body as a wall between the stampeding cattle and the young rider who was about to die. Her horse, a gray mare that Holt had chosen for her because the animal was steady and sure-footed and did not panic, responded to her commands with the immediate obedience of an animal that trusted its rider completely. They crossed the path of the lead cattle, forcing the front animals to turn, breaking the momentum of the stampede the way a rock breaks the current of a river, not by stopping it, but by splitting it, sending the animals around her instead of through her. Sterling saw her, understood what she had done, veered to safety with a shout that the wind swallowed whole, his horse scrambling sideways through deep snow, his face white, his eyes wide, his young body shaking with the aftershock of a death he had not seen coming until it was past. Then her horse hit ice. Beneath the snow, a sheet of frozen creek water extended from the bank into the meadow, invisible under 6 inches of powder, smooth as glass and twice as treacherous. The gray mare's hooves found it at the worst possible moment, at the apex of a turn, when the horse's weight was shifting from one side to the other, and the margin between balance and catastrophe was measured in fractions of an inch. The animal went down hard. Legs folding beneath it like something mechanical that had lost its power source. The front legs buckling first, then the hindquarters swinging sideways, the entire horse collapsing in a motion that was simultaneous and unstoppable. Phoebe was thrown from the saddle, her body arcing through the air in a trajectory that was all wrong, too high, too fast, rotating in a way that human bodies are not designed to rotate, landing in deep snow 10 feet from the ravine edge. 10 feet from a 100-foot drop onto rock and frozen creek bed. 10 feet from death. Declan saw it happen. He was 200 yards away on the far side of the herd, fighting his gelding through drifts that reached the animal's chest. And he saw the gray mare go down, saw the small figure in the navy dress launch from the saddle like something thrown, saw the arc, saw the landing, saw how close that landing was to the edge, to the place where the meadow ended and the empty air began. Time stopped. His heart stopped. Every thought in his head, every calculation about cattle and contracts and fence lines and fortress walls evaporated in the span of a single heartbeat and was replaced by something raw and absolute and terrifying. Something that had no name because he had spent 6 years making sure it never needed one. Something that seized his chest and squeezed and would not let go and made breathing impossible and thinking impossible, and everything impossible except the single overwhelming imperative to reach her. He was off his horse before conscious thought caught up with action. His boots hit the snow, and he was running, plunging through drift that fought every step, his legs driving forward with a desperation that had nothing to do with the cattle and nothing to do with the ranch, and everything to do with the image of a woman in a navy dress lying in the snow 10 feet from the edge of forever. Phoebe was already trying to stand, because of course she was, because Phoebe Langford did not lie in the snow and wait for rescue. She pushed herself up on her arms, got one leg under her, tried to rise, and her left ankle buckled beneath her, with a pain that whitened her face and pulled a sound from her throat that the wind nearly covered. But Declan heard anyway because his entire being was tuned to her frequency. Now every sense oriented toward her the way a compass orients toward north. She went down again, face contorted with pain, hands clawing at the snow, 10 feet from the edge. "Do not move," he shouted. The wind tore the words from his mouth, but she heard them because she was listening for him the same way he was listening for her, because something had happened between them in the past 24 hours that neither of them had planned or expected or knew how to name, and that something made his voice audible to her through a blizzard that swallowed every other sound. "The cattle," she said. "Forget the cattle." But she was right. Behind him, the herd was still dangerously close to the ravine edge. The lead animals had turned when Phoebe cut their path, but the momentum of 40 panicked bodies does not reverse instantly. They were milling, circling, confused by the wind and the snow and the absence of the horse and rider that had just fallen in front of them. One spooked animal could start the stampede again. One panicked steer could take a dozen over the edge with it. Rowan appeared beside them. He slid from his horse with the controlled urgency of a man who understood that panic helps no one. His boots found solid ground beneath the snow. His hands were steady. His amber eyes assessed the situation in 3 seconds, processing variables and outcomes with the mechanical efficiency that made him the most dangerous negotiator in the territory. "I have her," he said. His voice was calm, not cold. Calm, the calm of competence. The calm of a man who has made a decision and committed to it completely. "Go finish this." Declan looked between the cattle and Phoebe, between duty and something he refused to name but could no longer deny existed, between the ranch that was everything he had built and the woman who was everything he had not known he needed. The choice should not have been difficult. The cattle represented fortune, livelihood, the work of 14 years. Everything his father had started and everything his brothers had helped him finish. But Phoebe was lying in the snow with her face white and her ankle twisted and her body 10 feet from a cliff edge, and every fiber of his being was screaming at him not to leave her, not to walk away, not to choose the ranch over the human being lying in the snow. And the intensity of that scream told him something about himself that he had been hiding from for 6 years. Go, Fat Phoebe shouted from the snow. I am fine. She was not fine. She was pale and shaking and 10 feet from death, and her ankle was swelling beneath the boot that was already too large, and her hands were scraped raw from hitting the frozen ground. But her eyes, those cornflower blue eyes that saw through walls and past pretenses and into the terrified center of men who had spent their lives making sure no one could see them clearly, her eyes were steady, fierce, demanding that he do what needed to be done. Declan ran back to his horse, swung into the saddle with a violence that the gelding felt and responded to, surging forward into the snow hooves, churning breath, fogging. And he drove the remaining animals away from the ravine with a fury that had nothing to do with livestock and everything to do with the image of a small woman in a navy dress being thrown toward a 100-foot drop, an image that would live behind his ribs for the rest of his life, beside the image of her walking 12 miles through the blizzard, two pictures of the same woman doing impossible things, and the terror and admiration that those images produced was something he would spend years learning to carry. It took another hour to secure the herd in the eastern shelter, a natural formation of rock and timber that blocked the wind and provided enough protection to hold the animals until the storm broke. By the time they finished, Declan was half frozen and his hands had lost feeling inside his gloves, and the bay gelding was blowing so hard its sides heaved like bellows. Phoebe was unconscious across Rowan's saddle. He had lifted her onto the horse himself, moving with a careful strength that contradicted his usual detachment. Her body lay across the saddle in front of him, secured by his arm around her waist, her face turned into his coat, her breathing shallow but steady. Holt rode on her other side, one hand steadying her body against the wind, his face white with a fear that had nothing to do with cold and everything to do with the woman between them, who had ridden into a stampede to save a stranger's life and was now paying the price that courage always demands. The ride back to the ranch house was the longest of all three brothers' lives. The storm had not relented. The wind still screamed, the snow still fell. But the world had changed in the space of an hour, reconfigured itself around a new axis, and the three men riding through the blizzard with an unconscious woman between them understood each in his own way that nothing would be the same after this. Nell took charge the moment they carried Phoebe through the door. She did not ask questions, did not waste time on the details that could wait. She pointed at the kitchen table, which Holt cleared with one sweep of his arm, sending plates and cups clattering to the floor. They laid Phoebe down and Nell went to work with the efficient calm of a woman who had doctored men and animals for 30 years on a ranch where the nearest physician was 3 days right away. 3 hours of work, warming her slowly. You do not warm a person with severe cold exposure quickly because the shock can stop the heart. Nell knew this the way she knew how to bake bread and deliver calves through experience, and the accumulated wisdom of women who had kept people alive on the frontier when medicine was a luxury that geography denied them. Warm blankets first changed every 20 minutes, then warm stones wrapped in cloth placed along the torso and under the arms, then warm broth spooned between lips that were cracked and blue, the liquid carrying heat into the body's core where it was needed most. The ankle was treated, wrapped in cloth strips soaked in cold water, then elevated on folded blankets. Not broken. Nell determined this by touch, running her fingers along the bones with the gentle pressure of someone who understood the difference between a fracture and a severe sprain. Swollen, bruised so deeply that the skin had already begun turning the purple black of damaged tissue, but intact. The bones were intact. Bruises were cataloged and treated. A long scrape along her left forearm, where the frozen ground had torn through the sleeve of the navy dress. A bruise on her hip the size of a man's fist. Smaller contusions on her hands and wrists from trying to break the fall. Finally, Nell emerged into the hallway where Declan had been pacing like something caged, back and forth, 10 steps in each direction. His boots wearing a path in the hardwood floor that would remain visible for years, a testament to the 45 minutes he spent walking the same 10 feet, while a woman he had known for less than 2 days was being treated for injuries she sustained saving one of his men. She will live, Nell said. Her voice was tired but certain. Twisted ankle, some bruising, nothing broken. She got lucky. Lucky, Declan repeated. The word came out with a sharpness that made Nell raise her eyebrows, not in surprise but in recognition. She had heard that tone before, not from Declan, from his father. The tone Josiah Ashcroft used when discussing Eleanor. The tone of a man who cares too much about someone to speak about them calmly. Another 10 minutes in that cold, and we would be having a different conversation entirely, Nell said. She studied him, really studied him, the way only a woman who has watched boys become men and men become something harder can study a person. With patience, with the accumulated insight of decades spent observing the Ashcroft brothers navigate the space between what they felt and what they had allowed themselves to show. She saved Sterling's life out there, Declan. Cut the herd off before it could push him over the edge. You saw that. I saw it. She rode into a stampede in a blizzard on a horse she had never ridden before to save a man she had never met before. That is not desperation. That is not a woman with no other options doing whatever it takes to survive. That is character. The kind you cannot fake and cannot teach and cannot buy with dowries or political connections. I never should have let her come. You could not have stopped her. Nell's voice softened, not into weakness, into the particular strength that gentleness requires when it is deployed by someone who understands its power. That woman has steel in her spine. Reminds me of someone else I know. Declan stood in the hallway after Nell left, alone with the sound of Phoebe breathing through the closed door. Slow breaths, steady breaths, the breaths of someone who was alive because she had chosen to be, because she had walked 12 miles through a blizzard and then ridden into a stampede, and the combined force of those choices had not killed her, though it had come close enough that the margin of survival could be measured in feet. And he whispered something he had not said aloud in years, had not believed in years, had not allowed himself to need in years. Winter always ends. He was not sure if he was talking about the storm outside or the one inside him. The blizzard that had held the valley in its grip for days, or the longer, colder winter that had held his heart in its grip for 6 years. But standing there listening through the closed door to the woman who had walked through a killing blizzard and then ridden into a stampede to save a stranger's life, he thought perhaps for the first time since Rosalind Kemper had boarded a stagecoach and taken his trust with her, that the walls he had built might not need to be quite so high. He opened the door, sat down in the chair beside her bed, and waited. Because Phoebe Langford had come to Broken Hawk Ranch asking for nothing, expecting nothing, carrying nothing but $37 and a refusal to let fear make her decisions. And somehow that was more dangerous than any proposal, any dowry, any calculated arrangement that 23 women in 5 years had offered. She had not asked to be let in. She had simply knocked. And the fortress, for the first time, had not known how to keep the door closed. The blizzard held Broken Hawk Ranch for 4 more days after the cattle rescue, and during those days something shifted in the house on the mountain. Not dramatically, not in grand declarations or sudden confessions. It shifted the way seasons shift, in accumulations so small you do not notice them until the landscape has changed entirely, and you cannot remember what it looked like before. Phoebe Langford, despite an ankle that turned purple overnight and swelled to twice its normal size, refused to spend a single waking hour in bed. By the second morning, she had reorganized Nell's pantry from floor to ceiling. Every jar labeled in clean, precise handwriting, every container sorted by type and quantity. A written inventory created on paper she found in Rowan's study, listing every item, every amount, every estimated date of depletion, so that anyone in the house could determine at a glance exactly how much flour, salt, sugar, salted, meat, and dried beans remained for the winter. Nell resisted at first, the resistance of a woman who has maintained a system for 12 years and does not appreciate being told that her system has flaws. I have a system, Nell said, arms crossed, standing in the pantry doorway like a general defending territory. Your system requires you to be alive and present every time someone needs to find the cornmeal. Phoebe replied, not looking up from the jar she was labeling. My system requires literacy, which everyone in this house possesses. Nell stared at her. The stare lasted 5 seconds. Then Nell laughed, a real laugh, the kind that shook her shoulders and made her eyes water, and emerged from a place deep enough that it surprised even her. She had not laughed like that since before Josiah Ashcroft died. "Where did you learn to do this?" Nell asked, watching Phoebe work with the efficient speed of someone who had organized much larger operations on much smaller budgets. "I ran my father's household from the time I was 15. My mother died that year. 7 years of managing a budget that shrank every quarter while the expenses stayed the same." Phoebe paused and something that was almost a smile crossed her face. The first one Nell had seen that reached her eyes. That lived in them rather than just passing through. When money is scarce, you learn to count everything. And when everything has been counted, you learn that knowing what you have is worth almost as much as having it. Within 3 days, Phoebe had also taken over the ranch correspondence, which had been accumulating in Rowan's study in stacks that threatened to achieve structural significance. Letters from suppliers unanswered for weeks, invoices unreconciled for months, a filing system that existed only in Rowan's memory and was therefore inaccessible to anyone else, a fact that Rowan had never considered a problem because he had never imagined anyone else would need access to it. Rowan handed her a stack of papers 2 inches high with the cautious expression of a man offering a bone to an unfamiliar dog, not certain whether the gesture would be welcomed or his hand would be bitten. He stood in the study doorway and watched her sort them in half an afternoon, creating categories where chaos had lived, imposing order on disorder with a precision that made him look at the documents, then at her, then back at the documents as if verifying that the same person who had arrived in borrowed boots was now organizing his filing system better than he ever had. "You are wasted as a mail-order bride," Rowan told her one afternoon, leaning in the study doorway while she reconciled 3 months of cattle sale receipts against bank deposit records, her pen moving down columns of numbers with the speed and accuracy of someone who had been doing this work since childhood. "You should be running a bank. Women do not run banks. Women do not ride into stampedes and blizzards either." He paused, let the observation settle. "You seem to specialize in things women do not do." On the fourth morning of the blizzard, Holt led Phoebe into the main barn. She limped on her wrapped ankle, but refused the crutch Nell had fashioned from a broom handle, preferring to manage her own pain in her own way, to carry her own weight, even when that weight caused her to wince with every step. Holt understood that instinct. He shared it. The refusal to accept accommodation that might be interpreted as weakness, even when the accommodation was offered with kindness and the weakness was only physical. "This is Copper," he said, stopping at the stall of the chestnut mare. Her belly was round and taut with foal, her coat thick with winter growth, her eyes large and dark and watchful. She stood at the back of the stall with the careful posture of a pregnant animal protecting what she carried. "She will deliver in a few weeks, maybe sooner. I need someone to check on her when I am out with the herd." He showed Phoebe how to approach a pregnant horse. Slow, from the side, never from behind. Let the animal see you coming. Extend your hand palm down and let her come to you rather than going to her. Place your hand on the neck first because the neck is where trust begins. Speak low, not in words but in tone. Let her learn your scent before you ask anything of her body. Then the belly, palm flat against the taut skin. Pressure gentle but firm enough to feel the movement within. Wait, be patient. The foal will move when it is ready, and rushing, it is like rushing the weather. Pointless and counterproductive. Beneath Phoebe's palm, something shifted. A kick, small but definite. A declaration of existence from the warm darkness of the womb transmitted through layers of muscle and skin, and the palm of a woman who had never felt anything like it. "She likes you," Holt said when Copper leaned her big chestnut head against Phoebe's shoulder and blew warm breath across her neck, a gesture of acceptance that horses do not offer lightly. "She likes anyone who brings apples." "No." Holt's amber eyes, the same color as his brother's, but warmer, softer lit, from somewhere behind the iris rather than in front of it, held hers. "Horses know. They feel who is real and who is performing. They read intention the way you and I read words on a page. Copper does not trust easily. She has been handled badly before she came to us, and badly handled animals carry that memory in their bodies forever. But she trusts you, and she decided that in less than a minute." He taught her to check hooves, how to lift each foot brace it against your knee, and use a pick to clean packed snow and ice from the frog, the soft triangular structure at the center of the hoof, that is the horse's first point of contact with the ground. How to feel for heat in the hoof wall that might indicate the beginning of laminitis, the inflammation that can cripple a horse in days if it is not caught early. How to read the animal's weight distribution, because a horse that favors one leg is telling you something it cannot say in words, and the ability to hear what animals cannot say is the difference between a handler and a horseman. Phoebe listened the way she did everything, carefully, completely, asking questions that showed she was not just hearing, but understanding. Not just learning procedures, but grasping the principles beneath them. And Holt, who had spent his entire adult life communicating more easily with animals than with people, found himself talking more than he had in months. About the breeding program he wanted to start, about Copper's bloodline and what the foal might become, about the way horses remember kindness longer than they remember cruelty, which was, he said quietly, the opposite of how most men operated. These sessions in the barn became Phoebe's favorite hours at Broken Hawk Ranch, and the reason was simple. Holt was the only person in the house who did not make her feel like she was being evaluated. Declan watched her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. The gaze of a man trying to see through her, the way he saw through cattle buyers and political schemers, searching for the angle, the hidden agenda, the strategy she must be concealing, because everyone had a strategy. Rowan analyzed her with a tactical mind that she could practically hear clicking, processing her every word in action, the way his mind processed contracts, looking for leverage points and weaknesses in the terms of whatever deal she was silently proposing. But Holt simply shared what he knew with someone who wanted to learn. And the warmth of that simplicity was something Phoebe had not felt since her father read to her on winter evenings in Philadelphia before the ship sank and the money disappeared and the world stopped being kind. On the fifth morning, Phoebe found Declan behind the house splitting firewood. He had been at it for an hour already, judging by the pile of split logs stacked neatly beside the chopping block. Mathematically precise, each log the same length, each split producing halves of approximately equal size, stacked in alternating layers for stability and airflow, because wood that is stacked poorly will rot before it dries, and wood that rots is wood that is wasted, and Declan Ashcroft did not waste anything. She stood in the doorway watching him work, and he did not notice her. There was a beauty to it that she had not expected, not the beauty of performance or display, the beauty of competence, of complete mastery of a physical task refined over years of repetition until the movements were no longer movements, but expressions of the body's deepest knowledge. The way he placed each log on the block with precision, centering it, reading the grain, the way Rowan read contracts, looking for the natural split lines that the wood itself wanted to follow. The way he lifted the axe over his right shoulder in one smooth arc, his body coiling like a spring, shoulders and torso, and hips all winding together, storing energy in the twist of muscle and bone. All that power held in check for one instant before releasing it downward in a strike that split the wood cleanly every time. Same angle, same force, same result. "Teach me," she said. Declan turned axe in hand, snow in his dark hair. Surprise crossed his face and vanished. He was not a man who allowed surprise to linger. "What? Splitting wood. If I am staying here, I need to know how to do it." He wanted to say no. She could see the refusal forming on his face the way weather forms on the horizon, building from nothing, gathering mass and momentum. But then he remembered what she had said on her first night. "Why? Because you are a man," and the memory of that question and the tone in which she had asked it, and the way she had looked at him while asking it, dissolved the refusal before it could fully form. He reached for the smaller axe hanging on the wall of the woodshed and placed it in her hands. It was lighter than the one he used, but still heavy enough that she felt its weight settle into her arms and shoulders, demanding attention, requiring respect. Left foot forward, right hand at the base of the handle, left hand slides up when you lift, slides down when you swing. Power comes from the shoulders, not the arms. Look at where you want the blade to land, not at the blade itself. Her first swing missed the log entirely and buried the axe head in the chopping block with a thud that sent vibrations up through the handle and into her arms. Her second glanced off the side of the log, nearly tearing the axe from her grip, the handle twisting against her palms. Declan stepped behind her, close enough to correct her stance, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, feel the size of him behind her, the mass and solidity of a man who had been splitting wood and building fences and breaking ice for 20 years. not close enough to touch. Here, grip here. He adjusted the position of her hands on the handle, his calloused fingers briefly covering hers. The roughness of his skin against the smoothness of hers, and the contact lasted exactly as long as it needed to, and not a second longer. And do not watch the axe, watch the wood. The wood will tell you where it wants to split. Your job is to listen. Her third swing split the log into two pieces. Not clean. The halves were uneven, the angle slightly off the split, wandering from the center. But split. Accomplished? Done. A log that had been one piece was now two, and she had done it with her own hands, and the satisfaction of that was something that no amount of money or education or social standing could provide. Phoebe looked up, and there was something in her expression that made Declan forget he was supposed to be maintaining distance. Not pride. Something deeper than pride. The pure, unguarded surprise of discovering capability she did not know she possessed. The delight of a body learning that it can do more than it believed, that strength is not only for people who were born to it, but for anyone willing to learn it. Good, he said, one word. But from Declan Ashcroft, who measured language the way a miser measures gold coins, spending each one reluctantly and only when the expenditure was absolutely necessary, it was a fortune. The days accumulated. Small moments layered upon each other like snowfall, each one insignificant alone, but collectively transforming the landscape. Declan found a blanket draped over him when he fell asleep reading in the library, and knew without asking whose hands had placed it there. Phoebe discovered that someone had repaired the loose heel on her borrowed boots overnight, the stitching precise and strong, and executed by someone who understood leather and thread, and the particular kind of care that manifests not in words but in the quality of work done when no one is watching. Rowan noticed that the account ledgers now balanced to the penny for the first time in 2 years, and said nothing but started leaving his most complex correspondence on the desk where Phoebe worked, knowing she would organize it before he returned. And through it all, Declan orbited Phoebe the way a planet orbits something it is afraid to touch but cannot stop approaching. He found reasons to be in whatever room she occupied. Needed a book from the library where she was cataloging shelves. Required papers from the study where she was reconciling accounts. Had questions about the pantry inventory that could have waited but that he asked anyway because asking them meant standing near her, and standing near her meant being close to whatever she carried that made the rooms warmer when she was in them. Then he found reasons to leave. Because the warmth was too much. Because the proximity was dangerous. Because every minute he spent near her was another minute that the walls thinned and the fortress weakened, and the thing he had spent 6 years preventing came closer to becoming real. He asked questions that sounded practical, but carried subtext he could not quite articulate. How are the account, Jason Bingett, is your ankle better? Did Nell give you lunch? The questions meant something else entirely. They meant, are you still here? Will you still be here tomorrow? What is happening to me, and how do I make it stop without making you leave? Then the storm broke. On the 7th morning, sunlight flooded through the library windows for the first time in a week, turning the snow-covered valley below into a landscape of blinding gold. Every surface burned with reflected light. The mountains stood sharp against the sky so blue, it hurt to look at the kind of blue that only appears after storms, the sky's way of apologizing for what it has done. Phoebe stood at the window watching the transformation, one hand resting on the glass, as if she could feel the warmth through it. She could not. The glass was ice cold, and her fingers left prints in the frost that covered its surface. But she stood there anyway, looking at the valley that she had crossed on foot 7 days ago, the valley that had tried to kill her and had not succeeded, and the beauty of it in sunlight was so different from the beauty of it in storm that she could hardly believe it was the same place. She did not hear Declan enter behind her. Roads should be passable by tomorrow, he said. I know. You could leave. I could. She did not turn. Is that what you want? Now she turned, and the morning light caught her face in a way that made Declan's chest tighten, with something that was not desire and not fear, but some unnamed territory between them that he had spent 6 years pretending did not exist. The light turned her hair to gold, and her eyes to sapphires, and the lines of her face to something that belonged in the paintings his mother had left in the attic, the paintings nobody knew about, because Eleanor Ashcroft had created beauty in private the way her eldest son created walls. What I want does not change reality, she said. I came here as a mail-order bride. You do not want a bride. None of you do. You made that clear 23 times before I arrived. You are not them. The words escaped before he could catch them. They flew from his mouth like birds from a cage, unpredictable and irrecoverable, and they hung in the air between them, more honest than anything he had said in 6 years, more dangerous than any ravine or blizzard or stampeding herd. I feel like this house has been empty for years, and I did not notice until you filled it, he said, and his voice was rough, scraped raw by the effort of saying things he had never said and feeling things he had never allowed himself to feel. I feel like you see things about me that I have spent a decade hiding, and instead of using them against me, you just see them. Just hold them, like they are facts and not weapons. He was not looking at the valley now. He was looking at her, only at her. Every reason I had for pushing people away does not apply to you. Every test I designed to keep people out, you walk through. Not because you are extraordinary, though you are, because you are honest. And honesty is the one thing I never tested for because I never believed anyone would bring it. Declan, I am not asking you to marry me. I am not asking you to love 3 difficult men on a mountain in the middle of nowhere. I am asking you to stay long enough for us to figure out if this is real. If what I feel when you are in the room is something more than two lonely people finding comfort in proximity. Because if it is real, then every wall I built was wrong. And I need to know. Phoebe studied his face the way she studied everything. Carefully, completely. Searching for the lie, the angle, the calculation she had learned to expect from men who wanted something. She searched the way a woman searches who has been betrayed by the people who are supposed to protect her, who has learned that trust is a currency most men counterfeit. She did not find it. What she found instead was sincerity so raw, it was almost painful to look at directly, like staring at the sun on fresh snow. 1 month, she said. Give me 1 month. Let me stay. Let me work. Let me see who you are when you are not performing strength for strangers. Let me see who I am when I am not running from the last disaster. If it is real, we will figure out what comes next. If it is not, I leave. No guilt, no blame, no debt. 1 month, he agreed, but I will not pretend I do not care about you during that month. If I am feeling something, I am saying it. I have spent 6 years pretending, and it has cost me more than I can afford. Honesty works both ways. Agreed. The kiss when it happened was not planned by either of them. Declan reached out to brush a strand of hair from her face, a gesture so tender it surprised them both because tenderness was not something Declan Ashcroft practiced, and accepting it was not something Phoebe Langford expected. His calloused fingers touched her temple, brushed the strand aside, and lingered there for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. Their eyes met. The distance between them, which had been simultaneously too much and not enough, since the moment she walked through his door, simply ceased to exist. He leaned forward. She did not step back. And when their lips met, it was not with passion or urgency, but with the careful honesty of 2 people who had been hurt before and were choosing to trust again, despite every scar telling them not to. When they separated, Phoebe's eyes were bright. That was terrifying. Absolutely. Good, I am terrified too. He almost smiled. She almost laughed. And standing together in the golden morning light of a library filled with books that nobody had read for years, and paintings that nobody knew existed, in the accumulated silence of a house that had been waiting for exactly this moment, for one brief and perfect instant, the future did not look like more of the same. I did not expect you, Declan said quietly, but I am not letting you go. A man keeps his word, she said, and it sounded like the beginning of something. Not an ending, not a conclusion. The first sentence of a story that neither of them knew the shape of yet, but both of them, standing in the morning light with the taste of honesty on their lips, were willing to read.